Chapter 376, Victory Parade. Planes flew through the air as the German army marched through Paris in parade fashion. The Eighth Army showed off its advanced weaponry that helped the Central Powers win the war, while Bruno sat on horseback. The steed was one that had been brought to Paris for this exact affair, a true war horse of an ancient noble lineage far older than that of the man who it carried. The horse's magnificently strong body and elegant grace showed signs of having destrier ancestors, the same kind that the most noble and chivalric of knights used to have as their prized possessions. Bruno sat tall as he was dressed in his most excessively embellished gala uniform. Every medal and decoration he had been granted by the German Reich was proudly on display as he led the army through the streets of the vanquished enemy. The striking red, white, and black striped banner of the German Reich flew proudly behind him, as the color guard ensured that its majesty was never tarnished. French citizens stood by the wayside with complicated expressions. Over the past few weeks, as Germany prepared for this day, the German soldiers occupying France had begun providing food and medicine to those who needed it most, while German Feldgendarmerie pacified the banditry and revolts taking place in the countryside. France had finally capitulated, and now it was time for the Central Powers to celebrate their hard-earned victory. 2 years of monumental bloodshed and global war, and now peace had been established, an armistice was declared, and a proper peace treaty was being negotiated. The end of the war came with diplomatic challenges, assuring that parties which had already surrendered and signed their own treaties aligned with the latest nation to fall to the might of German steel. This peace could not be based upon vengeance, but the nations of the Central Powers needed something to show for their bloodshed. Sure, casualties were far better off for these nations than during Bruno's past life, but few wars still collected such a toll of human life. Reparations were needed, but they could not be so excessive as to crush the already fragile state of the failing French Republic. With all of this in mind, one could understand why the French bystanders were so torn. It was hard to be thankful for your conquerors. Sure, they marched into Paris and provided some much-needed aid to the starving and diseased population, and were even gentle with how they forced the nation's surrender. But these were also the men who had killed millions of Frenchmen during this war. Fathers, brothers, uncles, friends were lost in this war on a scale so unthinkable the French had a hard time recognizing it. An entire generation of young men now fertilized the fields outside of Germany's borders, and it was not easy to let this go. This was especially true for the soldiers of the Eighth Army, who had earned an infamous reputation in the war for being the Kaiser's shock troops. Breaking line after line of combat, they were the spearhead that led to the Allies' collapse in every front, and its members were naturally decorated for all that they had done. They proudly wore their unofficial unit insignia on their sleeves, showing that they were the unit with the greatest kill-death ratio in human history. Sure, they had not been in France long, but French soldiers were deployed and killed by these men in the Balkans and Italy. To see the German army's most elite and ravenous wolves marching through Paris while proudly waving the symbol of a skull, it was sickening to many of the French citizens, especially the women and children whose more emotional minds associated the logo with their lost loved ones. Eventually, the parade came to a stop at the steps of Versailles, where Bruno stepped forward and prepared the speech that the Kaiser had come to expect of him. He started the speech with legendary words spoken by Wilhelm in both the past life and this current timeline. Words that this time finally rang true. Words that could no longer be denied. We shall defend ourselves to the last breath of man and horse, and we shall survive this battle, even against a world of enemies. Never has Germany been vanquished when it was united. These were the words spoken by our Kaiser at the outset of this war. I feared when he said them that they would doom us all. But through our blood and the power of German steel, the Kaiser's words have proven undeniably true. We shall survive this battle, even against a world of enemies. Never has Germany been vanquished when it was united, and it never shall. Today, for the second time in 50 years, our banners wave proudly above the Palace of Versailles. The old world is gone. France cannot contest us on the land, and Britain dare not intercept our ships in the sea, while the skies belong to Germany and her people alone. This is the dawn of a new era, a German era, where our empire and those of our allies reign supreme in this world. With the combined might of Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, there is no power on God's green earth that can challenge us, whether in the field of science, medicine, economics, or military strength. We shall reign supreme. Long live Germany. Long live the Kaiser. Long live Russia. Long live the Tsar. Long live Austro-Hungary. Long live the Emperor. The combination of soldiers from every nation who took part in the war in Europe on behalf of the Central Powers had all begun to chant along with Bruno, as it became clear that the war was over, and resistance to the new order was futile. Woodrow Wilson's face was ugly as he watched Bruno use the Palace of Versailles to declare his new order. It was a slap in the face to the United States and its latent potential. Unfortunately for him, he had not been able to prevent France's immediate downfall in the slightest. The Republic fell quicker than anyone could have thought it would, and now they kneeled before their German masters, currying favor for the sake of scraps while the Germans prepared to enforce their will on their defeated neighbor. It was despicable, truly it was. If only the press didn't paint him in such a slanderous light during the last election. He could have dismantled the America First coalition once and for all, and in doing so, gotten the United States in the war early enough to make a difference. Or so he believed. But now that the war was already over, and just before the election at that, Woodrow Wilson's promises to rejuvenate the United States economy through the war industry had completely and utterly failed to manifest. The primary promise to the people he had made was no longer possible. The war was over, and the Allies lost. Woodrow Wilson was so upset by this news he threw his bottle of whiskey at the wall, causing it to shatter as he chastised his campaign manager for no particular reason. Just fucking great. The French couldn't even hold on for another 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and we could have gotten them some much-needed supplies. Yet look at them now. Surrendered within a single week of the German offensive beginning. How the hell did they manage to last this long, without a freaking spine to prop them up? Having been used to the presidential candidate's repeated drunken rages, the campaign manager simply sighed and shook his head, trying to remind Woodrow Wilson that the man had trusted the opinions of a young aide, which proved woefully incorrect. With all due respect, sir, we did try to warn you. The moment the man said this, he was dumbstruck by the flying bottle that hit him in the head and knocked him on his ass. Having been thrown by the presidential candidate at him with the intent to wound, Woodrow Wilson looked as if he was possessed by the devil as he shouted at the man he had just assaulted with all the fury of hell. Get the fuck out of my office and never come back, you worthless piece of shit. If I ever see your face around these parts again, I will have you strung up by a noose. Do you understand me, you worthless shit? Though he didn't realize it at the moment, this incident just now would cause most of Woodrow Wilson's campaign staff to leave him, and at such a critical point in the race no less. With the upcoming election, and nothing to stand on now that his largest promise to the people was void, along with the majority of his staff quitting overnight as a result of his drunken antics, the man who would have been the 28th president of the United States in Bruno's past life would find himself failing to achieve his goal a second time. Chapter 377. Forging Peace While Preparing for the Wars to Come. Peace talks were held near instantly after the French Republic surrendered, while the conference for the treaty to end the war was stationed in Versailles under the careful watch of the German army to ensure that no foul play was conducted by any potential parties which were hostile to the idea of ending the Great War. Bruno and the other generals of the Central Powers were visibly displayed in all the papers, laughing and enjoying their time in the city of Paris, as if they had come as conquerors. A notable picture was taken by the press, showing a young woman throwing herself at Bruno and the man getting rather violent with her as he shoved her out of her way and chastised her as a common harlot. However, Bruno was fairly unique in this regard, as the soldiers in his army and the other Central Powers enjoyed the company of the local women who, like every time someone invaded Paris, threw themselves at their latest round of conquerors. Heinrich, seeing this as a brief ability to relapse into his more playboy ways, was commonly witnessed by reporters with a young woman in both of his arms. An image that made it back to Berlin, causing both Heidi and Alia to sigh, face palm, and shake their heads at the scandalous image of the man who was near and dear to both of them. To Bruno's family, Heinrich was practically an uncle. He may not be related to Bruno by blood, but the two of them were united in the spilling of it, a bond stronger than those often had between biological brothers. And naturally this extended to Heidi, who perceived the man as if he were her brother-in-law, albeit a particularly shameless one. Alia couldn't help but sigh once more as she stood up after rolling the newspaper and tossing it in the garbage. Heidi couldn't help but make a comment about her future daughter-in-law's upbringing, as the man on the second page was her adoptive father, who had long since given up his playboy ways for her benefit. Well, I guess since you are a woman now, and will soon be marrying my son, he may have gotten ahead of himself and thought it would be a good opportunity to slip back into his old ways as a bachelor. Alia glanced over at Heidi with a stern stare as a chilling phrase escaped her perfectly curved lips. Oh, don't worry. I'll make sure to correct his errant behavior before he walks me down the aisle. She then flawlessly transitioned between German and Russian, letting her true thoughts escape her lips, not realizing that Heidi had long since mastered the Russian language. Such a stupid and foolish man. Alia only realized that her godmother and future mother-in-law had perfectly understood what she said in a fit of frustration when the woman broke out into laughter, prompting a sharp turn of Alia's neck so that her eyes could look at Heidi in abject horror as she realized her outburst just now was fully comprehended. Heidi, however, just outright admitted it with a dismissive comment that only made the girl feel more embarrassed. You're so cute when you're angry. No wonder you managed to charm my son despite your lack of proper heritage. I'm sure if you broke out into fits of Russian every time you got mildly frustrated, it would have been deeply endearing to the boy. Alia seemed quite nervous, not because of her upcoming marriage, but because her thoughts immediately drifted to an uncertain future as she commented on the current state of global affairs and the fears she believed were coming. I'm glad the war ended. In another 2 years, Erwin would be expected to serve, and I would not want him out there in the Great War. I don't know how you do it with Bruno. Knowing the danger he faces every time he leaves your side, how can you live with it? What if Erwin is called to war in the next few years? How will I be able to live with it? Heidi simply sighed and shook her head as she stood up and hugged Alia in a reassuring gesture, one that did not dismiss her worries as nonsense, but rather affirmed them. You're right to feel that way, especially since your marriage is getting closer. Hopefully that day doesn't happen, and Erwin serves in a time of peace before leaving the military and pursuing a far more safe venture in life. Bruno was unlucky. His brothers were able to serve their entire careers without ever having to fight a war, and yet he is a veteran of 4 of them now. This last one was especially tough for all of us. But I doubt you will have to worry about such a thing with your husband, because mine has already fought and won the wars for him. You just need to trust that everything will be all right, and that should such a time ever come, that your man will survive and come home to you. It's all you can do. Alia could only sigh and nod her head, trusting that her soon-to-be mother-in-law had all the answers, as she had lived through these worries 4 times now, each time greater than the last. Thus, she ultimately thanked Heidi before wandering off, as she had something important to take care of, something that would also help ease her mind and shift her focus to a more unbridled rage that only a woman scorned could truly understand. Thank you, Mother, but may I be excused? I need to go write a strongly worded letter to my father. After the act, he pulled into Paris. He needs to know just how much trouble he has gotten himself into before he steps foot in our home. I want him to dread returning to me. Heidi dismissed Alia with a graceful smile on her face, before becoming a little worried, the way a mother does for her child, as she expressed these thoughts aloud. Oh boy, I do believe I raised that a girl a little too fierce. Or maybe it's just her nature as a Russian. Either way, Erwin, my beloved baby boy, I might have made life difficult for you in ways I never intended. Do forgive Mommy, would you? Though Heidi said this out loud, she would not in fact warn Erwin about Alia's fierce temperament, as she after all felt extremely guilty about helping forge such an aspect of the girl's character, and could not reasonably face her son if that one day made him unhappy. Lucky for Erwin, he inherited his father's unwavering personality, which would allow him to face any storm, no matter how harsh, and tame it as its master. But that might be something the boy would need to learn in time, as the battles of matrimony were not something they taught a young student at the military academy. Rather, one could only excel in those after having gained ample personal experience on the matter. Chapter 378, Treaty of Versailles. After the war had ended, and the conference began to establish more permanent peace in the world, or at least attempt to do so. One thing became certain. France, as the last belligerent of the war, was expected to pay the cost Germany had incurred fighting it. Whether the use of ammunition, the buildup of arms, or the lives that had been lost. The figure, while staggering, was not as bad as what Germany had experienced in Bruno's past life. Nor did Germany make any unreasonable demands of France, like limiting the size of its army, forcing the abdication of its current government, or splitting up its territory, especially those lands which their economy relied upon. All in all, the Treaty of Versailles in this life was far more lenient than the one in Bruno's past life. As for the negotiation of colonial territories in the Near East, any possessions of claims by the Allied powers were immediately withdrawn. Instead, the Arab leaders present had agreed upon a united Arab state, a federal monarchy modeled after Germany. This state, as per previous conditions, allowed for the free pilgrimage of Abrahamic religions into the Holy Land, albeit with modern limitations like security checks at port of entry and limits to the duration of their stay without a proper visa. Turkey had established itself on borders east of Ionia, while the gains that Greece had made as a result of aligning with the Central Powers were solidified. As for the transfer of African colonies to Germany, the dream of a Middle Africa was established. Germany gained what it wanted from Britain and France in the region, but in the long term it would not remain under their control. In fact, Bruno had already discussed in secret his plans for German colonization with the Kaiser in private, and after explaining his reasoning, the Kaiser also thought this was a good idea. So why transfer ownership over so many African colonies to Germany if they were just going to go through a peaceful transitionary period towards independence and debt-trap diplomacy with the use of German mercenary forces employed as a regional security force? Because it would give the Africans a better perspective of the Germans. They weren't colonizers, they were liberators, gaining Africa from the British and France to give it back to the Africans who couldn't liberate themselves by their own means. This was quite honestly a method the Russians had used throughout Africa as a way of appealing to the nations in the 21st century, gaining economic and military advantages out of doing so, without incurring the cost associated with traditional colonialism. Ultimately, the maps in Europe did not shift too terribly much after the war, but the maps in Asia and Africa began to change. Japan seized large swaths of territory from the British and French, while Thailand regained its previous national borders. Having spent weeks, or even months, negotiating the finer details of the treaty, it was eventually signed and ratified by all nations involved, allowing the Central Powers to return to their homes and their families as victors and conquerors. However, if there was one majorly notable event that would go down in the history books, it was when the French leaders began protesting the sum of reparations they were supposed to pay, in which Bruno simply responded with two Latin phrases that completely shut them down. Vi victis, veni, vidi vici. The statement, woe to the vanquished, I came, I saw, I conquered, showed exactly the mood Bruno was in. After everything he had put the French through, the fact that their government still had the gall to bitch and whine about their treatment truly made him angry. And thus he proclaimed to their faces that they should cry more, and followed at this insult with another slap to the face by posing the question, what are you going to do about it? In the most elegant and classical way possible. After leaving Versailles, the German Kaiser couldn't help but laugh and shake his head as he pulled Bruno aside and warned him about the consequences of what he had just said with a far more severe tone in his voice than his previous jovial behavior had let on. You do realize the French will never forget this insult. Bruno, however, was perfectly stoic, as he responded to the Kaiser's worries with a far more grim statement than the man was expected. Good. Then they will remember what happens when they invade the German Reich. Bruno did not wait for another word to come from the Kaiser as he adjusted his coat and walked off to regroup with the other world leaders and generals. Wilhelm was definitely surprised by the curtness of the man's response, but he also understood the words behind it. They had so effortlessly dismantled France that there was nothing the French could do to oppose their whims and wishes, and they still had the nerve to make complaints. Bruno had to remind them, even if it humiliated them further during negotiations, that they didn't last more than a week against the current German army once the fatherland bared its fangs against them. And they could easily do so again. As a result, the Kaiser was forced to admit that the French had gone too far with their complaining, especially at a peace conference where they wielded no power to leverage in their favor. No doubt the fact that Bruno had chosen to intimidate them into surrender, rather than just burn their city to the ground, was an act of benevolence on his part, and they repaid him by whining. After thinking this through, Wilhelm agreed with Bruno's dismissive statements towards the French and their complaints, and even shook his head in disgust after giving Versailles one last look before departing from France once and for all. Peace had been secured, but France, Britain, Austro-Hungary, and several other European nations were left incredibly unstable as a result. The fall and winter of 1916 would be a cause for great celebration in the Western world, while the spring would be known for the lesser wars waged in the aftermath of the Great War. But for now, Bruno returned home, hoping to gain some much-needed rest and leisure before such a troublesome near future found him. Chapter 379. The long-awaited return home. The return home from war was far different from Bruno's expected it to be. In his past life, the atmosphere in Berlin was one of solemn defeat, revolutionary sentiment, and the violence of those who sought to take advantage of the crisis. This could not be said for this timeline. Germany was victorious in an overwhelming fashion. Losses were minimal and were well below the replacement rate. Germany's economy was bolstered by the war, not broken by it. Citizens of the Reich could proudly wave their banners and celebrate the return of their valiant heroes in the most lavish of fashions. The future was bright, and the storm clouds lingering far beyond the horizon. But the train ride was not particularly festive, not for Bruno and Heinrich at least, who sat alone in their own cart, drinking beer, and looking at photographs of years past. The difference between the scenes in these pictures and the one in front of them was that there were 3 men within the old images, and not merely 2. Bruno's face was cold, but one could tell by the twitching of his eyes that there was a deep lament and sorrow within them. Heinrich, ever opposed to their fallen comrade, was, for once, truly expressing his depression in a way he had seldom partaken in over the last decade. The 2 men drank and drank, bottles of beer piling up in front of them, almost as if they were in a competition to see who could consume the most of their favorite alcohol. Yet their expressions never changed. Their sense of loss was finally kicking in now that the war was won, and Eric's sacrifice which made it happen was only known to them. It was ultimately Bruno who spoke, his face twitching, his voice struggling not to crack under the weight of heavy emotion that was weighing down his heart and mind as he lifted his beer bottle in the air and proposed a toast. To Eric, the true hero of the German Reich, the terror of Belgorod, a loyal subordinate, and a great friend. Heinrich himself was forcing himself not to break down into tears at this point. The stupid nickname Eric had earned, whose meaning damn near destroyed their friendship, being brought up as a token of honor by Bruno, reminded him of past regrets that it was far, far too late to rectify. And perhaps as a sign of him finally letting go of all the animosity he had harbored towards his friend over differences in how they performed their jobs, Heinrich lifted his glass and repeated Bruno's toast. To the terror of Belgorod, the hero we needed but never deserved. After which, the 2 men were silent for the rest of their journey home, stumbling off of the train along with the other soldiers of the German army, who were equally intoxicated but for far more cheerful reasons. Young men were grasped by their wives and lovers as they entered the streets of Berlin, who had waited for them at the station, while Bruno and Heinrich walked over to their own families who were waiting for them. Alia seemed beyond pissed at her adoptive father, but when she noticed the state he was in, she said nothing. All the wrath she had prepared to vent on him for behaving ostentatiously while away was gone the moment she understood why Heinrich relapsed into his old and degenerate habits. It was not a way to celebrate, but to cope with the losses he has suffered in the war. Because of this, Alia greeted Heinrich not with the fury of a woman scorned, but rather the love and support of a daughter finding her wounded father returning home alive, if not all intact. "Father, I'm so happy you have returned to me." Heinrich, drunk out of his wits, had patted the girl's hair and assured her everything would be fine, even if his words weren't all that reassuring. "That's right. I'm home." Heidi looked at Bruno, whose tolerance to alcohol was vast, causing him to rapidly sober up after no longer continuing to poison his body with beer. She had a questioning gaze, of which Bruno simply shook his head, before assuring her that his friend would indeed be all right. "He will be fine. He just needs to sleep off the booze. Now how about we all go home? I am absolutely dying to spend time with my family. Bruno was very clearly in as poor of a mood as Heinrich, but he refused to come home and simply go to sleep without spending time with the ones he loved. They needed to know that they were his first thought of every morning and every night before he went to sleep. His every waking desire while at war was to return home and be with his loved ones in peace. Sure, right now he wanted more than anything to crawl into bed, form a cocoon with his sheets, and sleep for 1,000 years. But he couldn't do that. As a father, his family must come first, and that would always be his priority. Thus, Bruno went home and spent the night with his family, sobering up while eating a delicious home-cooked meal by Heidi, before crawling into bed by her side, sleeping off the overwhelming amount of alcohol he had consumed on the train trip to Berlin. The next morning, he would only have a minor hangover, which would disappear with a cup of coffee and the morning paper. He would read all about Woodrow Wilson's staff, leaving him almost in their entirety, and the public's opinion switching back to the Republican nominee, now that the Great War was over and the only path forward was to focus on that which had already been built over the last 4 years. When Bruno saw this, he would know that America would remain isolated until at least the next election in 4 years, meaning he had bought himself enough time to fight the smaller wars of the interwar period, while preparing for the next world war that would likely come as a result of the abysmal state which France had now found itself in. But that was a worry for another time. For now, Bruno intended to enjoy the peace which his victory had bought him. Chapter 380, Thousandfold. Months passed in the blink of an eye, and the seasons with it. The autumn came and went, as did the winter that followed. Soon enough, it was the spring of 1917. Both the German Reich and the Russian Empire had entered a new state of prosperity. Industrialization had been in full swing in Russia, and the wealth it gained from the war was monumental. Bruno knew now was the time to make a move, to permanently cement the alliance between Germany and Russia, and using his family as the glue that would do so. Eva had been promised to Prince Willem of Prussia, the grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the future heir to the throne. Elsa, however, was in her early teens, and without a man to be betrothed to. It just so happened that Erwin's wedding was around the corner, and invitations were being sent out to those who were close to the von Zehntner family. Powerful friendships had been built in the preceding decade by Bruno's hard work, and now that his children were approaching adulthood, it was time to cement those friendships into permanent alliances. The bedrock had been laid, pure Roman concern. It was now time to build a house upon it. Because of this, not only was the House of Hohenzollern in its entirety invited to Bruno's wedding, so was the House of Habsburg and Romanov. Bruno wanted to marry his daughter off to Alexei Nikolaevich, Tsarevich of Russia. Alexei was Nicholas' only son and was practically the same age as Elsa. In addition to the fact that the Romanovs were already seeking more permanent ties to Bruno and his family, Bruno was overly fond of the Romanovs, perhaps because in his past life they were elevated to the status of saints in the Orthodox Church as a result of their martyrdom, or maybe simply because he felt sorry for them. And his choice to marry his second daughter to the only son of the main line was as much one of personal sentiment as it was strategic value. Thus, he made sure the Romanovs were first and foremost among his invited guests, except for perhaps the Kaiser and his family. Heidi even watched as Bruno put of all of his thought and grandeur into the invitation, and knew whatever he was planning was significant. As a result, she was quick to ask for his thoughts on the matter. "What exactly are you scheming now with the Tsar of Russia?" Bruno, quick to notice his wife's presence, swiftly leaped out of his chair and grabbed hold of her waist, dragging her into his loving embrace as he whispered his thoughts into her ears. "I intend to unite our two houses in marriage. Elsa will marry Alexei, and Eva will marry Wilhelm. Our family will be the glue that unites the Romanovs and the Hohenzollerns, securing an alliance with Russia that guarantees both of our empires' security, wealth, and power for generations." Heidi was indeed surprised by the bold strategy and was quick to agree with it, as she was naturally familiar with the character of the young Russian heir. He's a good match politically, but also personally. The boy has grown up with only elder sisters, and Elsa is a year his senior. He would obviously know how to treat her properly considering his upbringing. Still, having our daughters be the future Kaiserin and Tsarina, it will create turmoil. There are those who do not like how quickly our family is rising. We're young, very young, and yet you hold more wealth and military power than any of the old houses, aside from the great emperors of Europe themselves. Tying our line through marriage directly into a position of royalty, it is a bold move, and a dangerous one. It is a gamble that will either build a dynasty that lasts 1,000 years, or see us all end in ruin. Bruno wiped his wife's bang from her eyes. His eyes were filled with passion and ferocity. He was quick to remind Heidi that he was well in control of these things. Of course it is. But nothing great has ever been achieved without ever grander risk and sacrifice. This isn't just about the future of our family, nor the Reich, but all of Europe. What we do, here and now at the start of this great century, will echo for eternity. There will be those who oppose us, even try to harm us. But the age where a man gained his lot in life by the position of his birth is gone. Now is a time where a man's merit determines everything. And if those fools dare declare war on me, I will remind them what happens to those who trespass beyond my boundaries. If Belgrade does not serve as a permanent reminder to those who would come after my house, then perhaps a few more cities will need to be razed to the ground, and the houses that built them with it. Despite the overwhelming gravity of Bruno's words and the dread contained within them, Heidi couldn't help but be proud and excited. The future they were building together was no longer just about their own family and its place in history. It was about creating a better world. And since Bruno had promised to inflict pain and suffering 1,000-fold on those who dared to provoke his fury, she could only stand there and accept the choice he had made and the path he was leading their family down. So be it. Whatever comes our way, we will face it together with blood and iron. Hearing his wife say these words and voice her support for him in this hour of divergence, Bruno couldn't help but cup her heart-shaped face and kiss her lips, before confirming she was as right as rain with her proclamation. I couldn't have stated it better myself. Afterward, the two began to set their play into motion. The wedding between Bruno's eldest son and heir to a Russian orphan bride would act as the catalyst that bound Germany and Russia together for generations to come. Chapter 381. The Changes of Seasons. Bruno was sitting in the yard of the estate, gazing at the new pool he had installed within the back. The depth of the pool was more than enough to meet the Olympic ratings as a dive pool in his past life, while its length and width met that of a lap pool of equal size. However, this pool was grand, decorated with large Baroque-style fountains on the edge, and slides that plunged past the fountain spouts and into vast pool from below. A seemingly flawless hybrid of practical fun and craftsmanship with the absolute elegance and artistry of a more noble past. Spring had come and melted away the snows, and for Bruno the temperature was more than adequate to sit on an inflatable tube with a beer in one hand, and while wearing nothing but a pair of swim trunks. His family were all playing in the pool, enjoying a modern style of fun together inspired by Bruno's past life, while the man himself was relaxing, trying to let the weight and burden of a war that crushed his shoulders slip off and drown in the water below. Of course, Erwin was a bit flustered. This was the most of his fiancée's skin he had ever seen. Her swimwear was by no means as revealing and lewd as the world Bruno had previously lived in, and was a more refined and modest taste suitable for a more sensible era. But still, it was enough to make a 14-year-old boy bursting with hormones blush in embarrassment, provoking a response from his father who was resting nearby with a beer in his hands. Bruno couldn't help but narrow his brow and lower his sunglasses as he stared at his teenage son before splashing him in the face and condemning him. "Oi, Letcher, I will see you. No looting the girls with those perverted eyes of yours. That's someone's daughter, you know." Erwin immediately wanted to drown himself in the pool with the overwhelming embarrassment he caused him as Alia and her friends looked over at Erwin and giggled at his current state. As for Heidi, she immediately looked over at her husband with a death glare, causing him to immediately paddle his inflatable tube in a 180, forcing him away from the fearsome gaze of a woman scorned. After which he made his way over to his son and handed him the beer in his hand. "Here, boy, drink. It'll help you feel less awkward." Erwin had never been offered an alcoholic beverage by his father before, and was shocked as he looked at the glass bottle and the bold letters engraved on its sticker. It was a beer company that Bruno had founded called Eisen. Well, saying that Bruno founded it was stealing credit. No, It was founded by one of the disabled veterans from the Iron Division in 1906 after returning from the Russian Civil War. Most of the volunteers who fought over there stayed in the army, either becoming NCOs or commissioned officers in the Great War, while others filled up the leadership positions of the Feldgendarmerie. However, those who were too wounded either physically or mentally to resume active service often went off to found their own ventures in life, which Bruno personally financed every single one of them as a sign of deep respect to the sacrifice they made in completely voluntary service within a foreign war. Eisen Brewery was one of these ventures, and had the emblem of the Iron Division as its logo, which Bruno was more than happy to allow. It was a symbol that, as far as he was concerned, belonged to every veteran of the Iron Division and not a single one in particular, let alone himself, who came up with the design using inspiration from his past life. It turned out the wounded veteran was quite the brewer, coming up with a series of traditional-style German beers that were better than anything on the market as far as Bruno was concerned, and it became his exclusive brand of beer over the years. Eisen was also incredibly popular among soldiers, as the company did massive charity donations to organizations designed to help wounded veterans. And yes, that included those suffering from mental disorders resulting from combat, such as shell shock, which had become increasingly popular as a result of the Great War. With all of this in mind, Erwin might have mistaken the meaning behind his father's sudden gift as something more serious than a simple peace offering, and the way that the boy damn near idolized the bottle caused Bruno to question his son's sanity. "What's wrong, boy? You never seen a beer bottle before?" Erwin was quick to snap back to reality as he shook his head and stuttered, trying to overcome his embarrassment once more. Then he hurriedly answered his father. "No, sir. I haven't had a beer before." Bruno raised a brow when he heard this, considering this was the German Empire where there was no set drinking age like his past life, and that drinking beer was quite common among young men and teenage boys, especially those in the military or the academy. Bruno found this to be unusual. He was about to interrogate his son firmly when he noticed the boy's gaze shifting between the beer and over at Alia once more. No longer a lustful gaze, but one of deep contemplation, as if he was trying not to give into the temptation as a way to prove to his future wife he was a man of temperance and discipline. A faint smile curled at the corner of his lips as he recognized the internal battle in his son. He'd seen it many times before, in young soldiers on the battlefield. The internal struggle between wanting to prove oneself and doing what felt right. But this wasn't a war. This was Erwin's first step into adulthood, and Bruno wasn't about to rush it. As a result, Bruno could only smile and shake his head before patting his son's shoulder, letting him know drinking wasn't the end of the world, and that it was okay to enjoy himself in subtle ways. "Erwin, it's just a beer. I'm not trying to pressure you or anything. It's your choice to make at the end of the day. But it's not as serious as a matter as you are making it out to be. Even as a married man, there are still times where you are able to enjoy yourself. But like I said, it's ultimately your choice, kid. Do what you feel is best. Now I'm going to go get on my knees and grovel in front of your mother for forgiveness, or else she will give me hell for the little prank I pulled on you later tonight. Have fun, because you're only a child once." Bruno then began to swim off under the surface of the pool, like a shark sneaking up on his prey, that being his wife. As for Erwin, he looked at the beer one last time before deciding to take a silent sip. There were a lot of complicated emotions in his mind as he did so, most of which was a recognition that as the years passed and he became older, his father had become a far less fearsome and tyrannical figure to him. In fact, now that he was on the cusp of adulthood, it was almost as if they were equals. Chapter 382, A Grim Realization. The aftermath of the Great War was far-reaching, global even. Bruno had changed destiny in ways that were now reversible. No matter how hard the three sisters of fate might try to steer the boat back to proper course, it was impossible to do so now. With all that had been done, more changes appeared, the natural course of the change in events, and what followed. Germany had asked for the colonies that the British and French empires possessed in Africa, which aligned with their concept of Middle Africa. At first, the world thought that the German Reich had done so to exploit them for their natural resources the same as Britain and France had done, only for the Kaiser to come out within a shocking declaration a few months after the war was concluded. "It is my intention to begin a complete and total process of decolonization. The fact remains that the German Reich and its people only engaged in this costly endeavor as a means to combat the hostile influences of the British and French empires. But mistakes have been made, and rogue colonial officials have abused their position to enact disproportionate vengeance on native populations that go well and beyond seeking justice for the innocent German citizens who were slain by mindless native violence. The fact of the matter is, the cost in maintaining control over the colonies and the risks it has posed to the safety and security of the German Reich are far greater than whatever tangible benefits we have gained as an act of necessity in the face of past Allied aggression. Now that we have gained control over vast new territories in Africa, we intend to begin a period of safe and sustainable position to local and autonomous rule, followed by full-scale independence in a way that works with everyone's best interests in mind. This, of course, includes all colonial possessions currently within the control of the German Reich. After all, the need for an empire abroad is antiquated thinking, as we have established a powerful and prosperous empire here in the heart of Europe. These were the words that had shocked the world. The era of decolonization had begun, not with a shot fired by the locals and war to retain control, but by the German Reich voluntarily ceding control over their colonial possessions back to the locals. The reality was that Bruno had given this idea to the Kaiser as a way to mitigate risks and expense, yet still control economic and security control over the region's long term. Lessons were learned in his past life on how to more effectively control a developing nation. One could do so through economical means, such as debt-trap diplomacy, while using mercenary forces to maintain authority in the region. Mercenary forces that would be paid by the locals for protection, meaning that the German Reich would be profiting from security operations, rather than hemorrhaging cash into the red zone doing so. It was truly a masterful plan for global hegemony that Bruno had crafted from lessons learned in his past life. And as Bruno sat in his office, forming this mercenary group, he made a sudden realization as he looked at the list of applicants who had begun to sign up for its ranks. It was subtle at first, and then jarring, as Bruno dropped the pen in his hand that he had been tapping repeatedly within his notebook, which contained the organizational structure of this new army for hire. There were many men coming home from the war, forever tainted by the horrors in it, who were already having a hard time reintegrating. And those services existed to help with shell shock and the addition of combat stimulants like Pervidin, services set up by Heidi's charities. Some men were just incapable of adjusting to a time of peace, and instead signed up for this new mercenary outfit the moment they heard about it. And it was when Bruno realized how many veterans of the Great War were desperately applying to join its ranks, it hit him, like a brick to the back of the head. The man most suited for this work, to lead this band of misfits incapable of properly integrating in an era of peace, was a man he had shot dead with his own sidearm. A man who was among his greatest friends and brothers in arms. In that moment, a large droplet of water fell upon the ink that his fountain pen had stained the parchment with, creating a large misshapen blob, as another fell on top of it, followed by another, and another, until the tears of guilt and tragedy began to crash down around him. Bruno's voice was wretched as he struggled to breathe, overwhelmed by his own existential terror, but eventually he managed to force his guilt free from the confinements of his heart. I'm so stupid. There was another way. This entire time, there was a place for him to belong. And I fucking killed him. Did I even try? Why couldn't I see it? Why, God damn it? Bruno was a man who seldom lost control of his emotions. But in that moment his grief shifted into a moment of unbridled rage as he swiped everything on his desk, including his lamp off of it, shattering glass and oil alike on the floor, as he began to physically tear his thick oak desk apart, first attempting with his hands, before reaching for a more brutal nearby instrument to smash it to bits with. In the end, he collapsed back in his seat, as if the weight of the world had crushed him into a fine meat paste, his bones losing all strength as he sat there with his head in hands cursing himself for the simple sin of not being omniscient. God fucking damn it. Silence remained for the rest of the night, before Bruno emerged from his solitude with a haunted gaze, one which nobody would realize, as he would immediately crawl into bed and fall asleep, recovering from his physical turmoil by the time he woke up the next day. But some wounds would remain unseen. Chapter 383, Light in the Darkness. Some days were easier than others. Coping with what he had done, the mistakes he had made, even when he had such overwhelming knowledge of the past, present, and future. It was a heavy burden, one whose weight sought to crush Bruno's very will. But the past could not be undone. Sure, there was an opportunity that he had completely neglected, perhaps because he was so sure of his foresight and knowledge of how the future would play out. But to wallow on it, and to continue to suffer in silent misery? That was not an option. Eric's death had been a heavy blow, one briefly suppressed by the need to finish the war with France. Only now, re-manifesting in subtle ways that only those closest to Bruno would truly comprehend. For starters, his appetite seemed to have shifted. A man once known for happily eating every scrap of food on the plate which was served to him, especially if the meal just so happened to be cooked by his beloved wife, and not the kitchen staff that day, had begun to pick at his food throughout meals, eating at best a fourth of what remained. Then there was the lack of drinking. While Bruno had largely resolved his excessive alcoholic intake, aside from a few small moments of either celebration or lament, he had always enjoyed a liter of beer with his dinner. Yet for the life of him, he could not be compelled to even pour himself a glass. No, something was wrong. And naturally his wife detected this immediately. At first, she tried to give him space to figure out and process whatever was bothering him. But as the weeks passed, and their eldest son's wedding quickly approached, she realized perhaps an intervention on her part was needed. Because of this, Bruno suddenly found himself confronted by Heidi during a random encounter within their large, palace-like estate. She was sitting in his office, waiting for him, something she had never done before, and she was seated in his chair no less. It was important to note that Bruno never allowed anyone into his private fortress of solitude without expressing permission. This extended to his villa staff, as well as his wife. But today the woman had invited herself into the hidden abode, and sat directly in Bruno's spot, waiting for his eventual arrival. Only she knew how long she had been sitting there, passing the time God knows how. In the end, Bruno was too tired to lecture the woman on her violation of the boundaries he had set years in the past, nor did he care that she had stolen his personal seat, a violation of his territorial nature. And that was what drove Heidi over the edge, instantly sighing and shaking her head before expressing her true thoughts aloud. When a hound refuses to eat, it becomes a matter to worry over, but when he refuses to put up the slightest resistance to the invasion of his territory, that's when you know something is seriously wrong. What has happened? Is it the war? Bruno did not immediately speak, instead sitting down in one of the two chairs that lie before his desk, always there for the potential visit of guests into his home. It was as if he were a stranger in his own home office. Nevertheless, Heidi waited patiently. Some things needed to be thought through thoroughly before speaking, or perhaps needed time to fully build the courage to face. In the end, Bruno just spoke. No sigh, no indication of any prior expression, just cold and chilling words reflecting his current perceived reality. It's not the war that haunts me, or what I did within it. Hell, it's not even the things I did outside of its scope here in the fatherland. No, the specter which disturbs my peace is what I didn't do, but could have done. The potential future that blinded me because I was so assured of what I was already doing, and it being the only path to follow. Eric's dead because I couldn't see an opportunity for him to escape. It wasn't just me. He also didn't realize that there was a potential where everything went down as it did, except he was still capable of living and thriving in an environment far from the Reich, where he could do what he was meant to do and not be a risk to those few loved ones he still held in his heart. For years I had planned the Kaiser's recent proclamation of decolonization and how we would use it as a practical means of permanently trapping Africa within our sphere of influence, reaping all of its benefits while disposing of all the risk. And yet for the life of me, I couldn't see that this was Eric's destiny, or one potential destiny, one where he could still live, as a mercenary warlord, maintaining security operations for the Reich within our former colonies, while extracting wealth from the new and independent states in exchange for his services. A cutthroat leader who could install coups and maintain total deniability for the Reich, while never being a risk to the fatherland. Had I simply faked his death and sent him to Africa to be the leader of this new mercenary outfit I am forming under a new identity, he would have never needed to die. I couldn't see it. No matter how many times I thought it through, I couldn't see such an obvious path. Not until it was too late. and that is what haunts me. From the day I was first born into this world, I have been 10 steps ahead of my enemies. Everything has played perfectly in my own hands. My will has forged a new timeline, and yet, it is also my will that killed Eric. Because I simply couldn't see a viable option, a world that aligned with my ideals where in the end he was still alive. Even though the answer was so easy to comprehend and was staring right in front of me the entire time. Heidi had naturally known the truth about Eric's death since the moment it happened, and she had been there for Bruno when he was the executioner, helping him overcome his grief. She was never angry with him for what he had done, as she too knew it was necessary. But to hear Bruno's current thoughts and the overwhelming burden of responsibility, guilt, grief, and self-doubt, it was enough to force her to tears as she stood up from her chair, walked around the desk, and got on her knees, holding Bruno's hand and forcing it to her cheek, letting him know there was still some warmth in this world, even as it became increasingly cold from his own perspective. The two of them sat there in silence for some time, as neither of them really knew what to say. Chapter 384, A Wedding in the Wake of Winter Part 1. Days passed, and soon too did the weeks that followed. Eventually, Bruno began returning to his normal self. He would never forget the cost of his arrogance, and the ultimate price that had been paid by Eric, one that may very well not have been needed. And while the realization that he was entirely at fault for the death of his best friend after all may have been enough to break a lesser man, it only further tempered Bruno's resolve to become the master of not only his fate, but the destiny of the world. This was a tragic misstep, a mistake, as all men were prone to making, and perhaps the most costly mistake Bruno had ever made in his life. But, despite having the overwhelming advantage of future knowledge and a high intellect to actively analyze and predict the effects of the butterfly effect in most cases, at the end of the day, Bruno was still a mortal man, and this was a limitation he must accept if he were to move forward. It wasn't that he was disregarding this grand tragedy as merely the result of his own mortality, rather a recognition of his own weakness that had led to this result, and a need for him to do better in the future to prevent such another disaster from befalling him and the people he loved. As with all forms of grief, all one could do was take each day one step at a time. And in the end, after putting one foot in front of the other, Bruno was surprised how soon he was walking out that door, back to a normal life. The pain would remain, maybe forever, or perhaps it would pass in time. Regardless, Bruno was not a man who had the luxury of shutting down and hiding in his office all day. There were things to do and events to plan for, and if Eric were here to tell him words of wisdom, he would condemn Bruno for having wasted so much time already wallowing in grief. This was ultimately the mentality that Bruno needed to move forward and forge ahead in life. Because at the end of the day, that was what life truly was, enduring pain and evolving from it. A never-ending struggle that one would continue to fight until the day they died. Soon enough, Erwin's wedding day arrived, to be held in the most beautiful and holy of Berlin's many cathedrals. The guest list was massive and highly exclusive, with family, friends, and important figures that Bruno had established personal ties with over the years, all of which came to see the eldest son of Bruno and Heidi married. The celebration itself was extremely traditional for German culture, and was an affair that Bruno would never forget in his life. When he witnessed his son kiss his beautiful bride, even Bruno had to admit he was holding back a single manly tear. Heidi, of course, was a mess, crying in joy as she witnessed her eldest son on his wedding day, hugging and kissing the boy's forehead the first chance she got while expressing her thoughts incoherently between her tears. My boy, beautiful boy, my beautiful boy is now a man. Erwin seemed rather embarrassed by his mother's pitiful display, and felt the need to chastise her to properly compose herself, but his father placed a hand on his shoulder and shook his head, cutting him off before he could make a mistake. Just let her have this one, Erwin. You know how your mother gets when she's emotional. Heidi continued to cry, while also mixing in a bit of pouting, the idea that her own husband would betray her like this and assert she was being overly sensitive when she believed she was being the perfectly normal amount while witnessing her eldest son's wedding. But she ultimately remained silent, not wanting to have a fight with her husband over something so petty, and on her son's wedding day no less. As for the bride in question, she seemed quite happy. Sure, their marriage was a little unusual in this day and age, What with the age gap between them and the fact that her husband was still a teenager. However, at the end of the day, it was nothing so far removed from the norm that it was taboo, and she had grown to care deeply for Erwin over the years, especially after their engagement was announced. The little brother she never truly had, who she had spent so time around during her initial years in the German Reich, had finally matured into a proper man, and one that she was now married to. It was a bizarre thing, or perhaps one might think so if they were from the 21st century. But European aristocratic marriages were often far more absurd than this. Thus, in the end, Alia was quite happy with the arrangement. Any other woman would be too, because Erwin was the heir to a grand fortune and the son of one of the world's most powerful figures. The status it represented to be his wife was enormous, and that was despite his young age. But such senseless materialism was something Alia cared very little for. She was, after all, an orphan from the lowest class of Russian citizens. She had lost her family at a young age and witnessed her country ravaged by war. The idea of pursuing such materialistic possessions and such useless things like status as the be-all and end-all in life was a notion that she had never developed as a result of her troubled childhood. No, what she wanted was a family. A true, loving family like the one she had lost all those years ago. Over the years, Alia had grown to envy the relationship that Bruno and Heidi had, and now she could finally have one of her own, as she knew Erwin was such a man to provide that love, warmth, and support to her, while also being strong and capable enough to protect their place in this world. And that was all that really mattered to Alia. Because of this, Erwin and she would have a long and happy marriage. However, what history would truly remember this day for had yet to be revealed, and would only do so later in the night at the reception being held in Bruno's own estate. Chapter 385, A Wedding in the Wake of Winter Part 2. After the wedding itself had been concluded, Bruno's family and their multitude of guests retired to his grand estate to engage in celebration. The bride and groom had begun their traditional waltz on the dance floor, as the attendees watched with varying and complicated expressions on their faces. Bruno was a man who had come from a young noble house. Through iron and blood, they had established their prominence over the course of the last century. Born in steel and fire during the Napoleonic Wars and later cemented in the unification of the German Reich as masters of industry and military command. Now, the current generation had risen to such heights that the house had earned the title of counts. That was, of course, the primary branch, but Bruno's cadet branch held even greater titles: Grand Princes in Transylvania and Princes in Russia. Because of this, the young boy who would become a man this night was of significant noble heritage, even if the age of his house was not as grand as its recent elevation in status. Yet he was marrying an orphan girl from Russia, something that reflected a new and increasingly common tradition among the lower nobility, even as they ascended to the greatest heights. Morganatic marriages were becoming more prevalent, and to many of the old nobles from ancient houses, some of which predated even the mighty kingdom of Prussia, this was a troubling development. To Bruno, however, it was simply the natural evolution of the world, nothing to fear. In time, many people of lower birth would rise to nobility through their own merit. But to others who watched in silence, this was a sign that their power was waning. Because of the complex and varied backgrounds of the gathered guests, their reactions were as diverse as the houses which they hailed from. But this was not a concern for the bride and groom. Rather, for Erwin and Alia, there was no one else in the room but the two of them as they lovingly embraced and danced across the floor. Midway through the set, Alia placed a hand on her young groom's head and balked in disbelief. "Since when did you grow so tall? Last I remember, you were just an adorable little boy clinging to my skirt." Erwin could only chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned in, whispering intimately to the older woman he had just married. His words were both teasing and gentle, carried by the soft breeze that brushed against her delicate, pale ears. "It's not my fault you haven't been paying attention." With that, he pulled away, executing a flourish perfectly in tune with the traditional melody playing in the background. His movements, effortless and refined, complemented his bride flawlessly, leaving her momentarily stunned, for she had never once suspected that he could dance. Meanwhile, in the background, the boy's father simply smiled and shook his head. It was as if, The very moment Erwin spoke his vows and kissed his bride, the boy he had known had vanished, replaced by a confident young man, ready to build his own house upon a foundation of Roman concrete. There was no longer a need for a father's constant vigilance. His son had outgrown it. And so, without a word, the father turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd to resume the business he had long conspired in the shadows. Before he left, however, he gave a single, solid nod of approval, an unspoken exchange between father and son, shared in the briefest of moments. No one else saw it, and no one else needed to. Bruno, having walked off to search for his target of the evening, found the man in question not far from the dance floor, entertaining other guests whom Bruno had invited, figures of similar or near equal prestige. Yet the Tsar witnessed his host approach. He was quick to apologize to those who swarmed him, breaking away from their relentless pursuit. Instead, he immediately found Bruno, grasping him by the shoulder, almost desperate to escape their attention, while making a public display of camaraderie to show respect to the host of this grand celebration. Well, if it isn't my greatest friend and the host of this wonderful evening, Prince von Zehntner, let me congratulate you on your eldest son's marriage to his beautiful young bride. Immediately after saying this, the Tsar of Russia leaned in close and whispered something to Bruno in a voice so low only the two men could hear. Thank God you arrived just now. It would appear you are my savior yet again, my friend. If I had to spend another moment surrounded by those jackals, I would have been compelled to throw myself off your balcony, if not for the dreadful thought that such an affair would forever blight the beautiful union of your son and new daughter-in-law. Now, please, take me somewhere solitary with some vodka. The fact that Nicholas could speak so informally with Bruno was a sign of the extent to which he trusted the man. And while monarchs and dignitaries approached Bruno left and right in pursuit of his talents and wealth, he had always kept them at a respectful arm's length. But today was his son's wedding, and Bruno had an important proposal to make to the Tsar. Thus, he welcomed the man's gesture, proactively guiding him to a quiet place away from the glitz, glamour, and, of course, attention. With an almost studious tone in his voice, Bruno slightly bowed before the Tsar, recognizing the man's superior position, before leading him toward his private office, far from the noise and the jackals. Of course, Your Majesty, your wish is my command. Please, follow me. I believe I know just the place you're looking for. Nicholas, perhaps a little too jovial and friendly, patted Bruno on the back thrice before following him away from the crowded festivities. There, in seclusion, the two men would silently broker an agreement that would shape the world for generations to come. But no one outside that room would know of it. Not yet. Tonight was a night of celebration. Chapter 386, A Wedding in the Wake of Winter Part 3. Having escaped the festivities and celebratory ambience, Bruno and the Tsar of Russia found themselves secluded in the former's office. The Tsar was surprised by the minimalistic decorations, a stark contrast to the grandeur of Bruno's Baroque estate. A villa so vast and opulent it could be mistaken for a palace, were it not for the fact that in Germany, his home nation, he held the title of a mere count. Regardless, the room was precisely as Bruno intended. No esteemed portraits of past ancestors, no self-aggrandizing paintings of his own exploits. Instead, only photographs from his time in war adorned the walls, framed in well-crafted but restrained trappings. The earliest among them depicted the Boxer Rebellion, where a barely 18-year-old Bruno had begun his military career. Next were images from Manchuria, where he had fought against the forces of the Tsar as a military advisor dispatched by the Kaiser to aid the Imperial Japanese Army. One particular photograph caught Nicholas's gaze, and for a moment, a grim and solemn memory surfaced, one he had tried to forget. Then came the photos from the Russian Civil War, where Bruno had redeemed himself, clad in the distinctive black, silver, and red uniform of the infamous volunteer unit, the Iron Division. The trenches of Tsaritsyn, St. Petersburg, Belgorod, and the regions beyond bore witness to their ferocity. One image stood out, a grim testament to history. In it, Bruno stood over the kneeling figure of Leon Trotsky, the infamous founder of the Red Army, who cowered in a pool of his own urine and tears. Bruno's sidearm was aimed at the man's head, a cigarette hanging from his lips, his expression one of sheer disdain. as if he were putting down a rabid dog rather than executing a man. Following these were images from the Great War, nearly a decade later. It was the longest interval between battles in Bruno's military career, but also the bloodiest conflict of them all. From Serbia to Albania, Bosnia to the Ottoman Empire, through the Italian Alps, and finally, the victorious march through Paris. Each moment captured alongside the men who had fought and bled beside him. Yet, it was not just the images that told the story of Bruno's warpath. Displayed in the room were the grand accolades he had earned from three of the world's mightiest empires, each accompanied by the ceremonial uniforms they adorned. First was the uniform of a Russian field marshal, bedecked with the highest honors of the empire, personally awarded by the Tsar himself for Bruno's strategic contributions during the Russian Civil War. Beside it hung the galley uniform of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, modified with Hungarian embellishments and adorned with its most prestigious orders and decorations. And finally, the uniform Bruno wore when not on the battlefield, the General Feldmarschall of the German Reich, his true rank, granting him absolute command over Germany's military forces. It, too, was stacked with grand decorations bestowed upon him by the Kaiser. Each uniform, each medal, each insignia told the tale of wars waged, battles fought in the trenches alongside his men, and honors earned not through birthright or social connections, but through blood, sweat, and tears, his own, his soldiers, and most of all, those who had dared to oppose him. Many monarchs and their heirs wore such regalia merely as a formality of their station. But in Bruno's case, each decoration was a grim testament to the millions who had fallen by his command. The realization sent an involuntary shiver down the Tsar's spine. And then Bruno's cold, callous words reached his ears. "Please sit. I have a proposal to make to you. One that I believe will change our destinies, and that of the world, forever." Tsar Nicholas II had matured greatly as both a man and a ruler since the failures of the Russian Civil War. Failures that, in this timeline, had been hastened by Bruno's interference. Yet, even now, in this moment, a sense of unease lingered. Though Bruno was offering friendship, there was an unmistakable weight in his words, as though some unspoken cost was yet to be revealed, one that might be far too steep. Even so, Nicholas took a seat, momentarily forgetting his own imperial stature in the presence of a man who, by rank, was still a lower noble. Bruno, ever the host, poured them both glasses of the finest vodka he could procure, so smooth it was like drinking water. He raised his glass in an untraditional Russian toast. Prognost. The two men drank under this word, and without wasting a moment, Bruno cut straight to the point. "My eldest daughter has been engaged to the Kaiser's grandson. No one knows this aside from the two of us. And I am telling you this because I want my second daughter to marry your son and heir. You understand what this means, don't you?" Nicholas was stunned. That Bruno held honorary titles of high nobility in multiple empires was one thing, but in Germany, he remained merely a count. Marrying his daughter to an imperial prince, one who would inherit the German Reich, was well above his station. It was not that Nicholas opposed such a marriage. In truth, for years, he had sought a way to forge closer, more permanent ties with Bruno. But the prior revelation complicated things. If Bruno had secured a match between his daughter and the Kaiser's grandson, it meant something was brewing beyond what the nobility could see. What sorcery had Bruno conjured to gain the Kaiser's approval? The old nobility of Germany had always been his primary obstacle. Surely, this would rattle their ancient slumber. As if reading his mind, Bruno chuckled, a knowing smirk crossing his lips before he answered. "Austro-Hungary won't survive the decade at this rate. Nationalism is festering in the Balkans, and for a multicultural empire like that which the Habsburgs rule, this is a death sentence. I will leverage the title they grant me and the alliances I have forged to persuade them to cede the Archduchy of Austria and its strategically vital lands to the German Reich. In exchange, I will relinquish my claims to Transylvania and trade them for new titles in Tyrol, an independent grand principality within Germany. That will make me a monarch in my own right. And with that, I can serve as the binding force that permanently cements the alliance between our empires. The question I must ask is this: are you willing to undertake this venture with Wilhelm and me? A venture that will shake the foundations of the world itself." The Tsar was stunned into silence. This was no simple marriage proposal. This was a realignment of history itself. And in that moment, he could say nothing. Nothing at all. With this proposal made, the two men sat there, drinking in absolute silence, a vacuum where only the weight of Bruno's words remained. Chapter 387. The morning after. The alliance being brokered between the Tsar of Russia and the future Grand Prince of Tyrol was something that nobody would be aware of until much later. Rather, the entire attention of the reception for Erwin and Alya's wedding was on their relationship and the beauty it represented. Not only the coming of a new age of nobility where common and noble classes intertwined to the point of marriage, but also the end of the war. It was a wedding in the wake of a very cold and dark winter. Spring had come, and the winds of war had passed. The storm was well beyond the horizon, and the future was bright. This was indeed one of the reasons Heidi had prepared her son's wedding for the beginning of spring. But as with all good things in life, the party soon came to an end, as Erwin and Alya found their hearts beating steadily as they climbed the steps to Groom's bedroom, where they spent their first night together as husband and wife. By this time, even the Tsar and his family had left the estate. But when Nicholas did so, there was a silent and tacit understanding between him and Bruno that some form of agreement had been made. Bruno awoke bright and early the next day as he descended the staircase, after taking a morning shower and performing other basic hygiene that was required before any civilized man began his usual routine. After which he sat down at the breakfast table, noticing that his entire family were gathered other than the newlywed couple, to which Bruno smirked while the maid poured him his daily cup of coffee, taking a brief sip and smiling with closed eyes, as if he had entered a state of true bliss. Only after building up such a silent and smug atmosphere did he finally make an inappropriate joke about son's wedding night. It would appear that I fully underestimated that boy's stamina. I suppose he is at that age. Poor Alya. Heidi immediately rolled up the newspaper and smacked her husband on the shoulder like she was disciplining a mischievous stray, all the while commenting on his deliberately poor choice of words. Can't you have the slightest decorum in front of our daughters? Why must you always do this? Considering the woman was only playfully admonishing her husband, Bruno could only chuckle heartily as he restrained his wife's fury in a similar way, assuring her with a soothing voice that he was just having a little fun at their son's expense, while the man in question descended from the staircase fully clothed with his beautiful new bride in tow. I was only having a little fun. Honestly, woman, you really should do something about hey. There is my little man, and his loving young bride as well. We were just talking about you too. Erwin seemed to have gained an entire lifetime's worth of confidence overnight, as he no longer appeared to have the slightest trace of embarrassment at his father's jester-like behavior. Instead, he sat down at the side of the table next to his wife, while his sisters looked between him and their father, blushing at the remarks that were just made. That is his oldest two sisters. The other batch of children were still far too young to truly comprehend the meaning of what happened last night, or their parents' remarks. Erwin finally cleared the air, reaching towards the food on the table to serve to his wife's and his own plate as he did so. Sorry about the wait. Alya and I were really tired after all the dancing last night. We somehow managed to oversleep. Alya blushed upon hearing her husband's words, unconsciously grabbing hold of his hands as she lowered her gaze in embarrassment. While Heidi damn near choked on her own coffee after hearing her beloved baby boy say such a shameless thing. Bruno, however, was as proud as a father could be as he smirked smugly all while complimenting his son on finally becoming a man in the worst possible way. Yeah, dancing will have that effect on you. Why, your mother and I danced all night long the night we got married, long after everyone else had fallen asleep, didn't we, dear? Heidi choked on her coffee a second time, this time much more fiercely, as Bruno patted her back in an attempt to soothe her cough. All the while the oldest of their children, Eva, was quick to make an embarrassed remark while digging into her food. So gross. This remark provoked a response from her father, who was quick to look over not towards his eldest daughter who had made the statement, but his second oldest daughter who was trying her best not to pass out from sheer embarrassment and awkwardness. By the way, that reminds me. Elsa, you will be marrying Prince Alexei of the House of Romanov when the two of you come of proper age. The Tsar and I agreed upon this last night while your brother and his bride were dancing. Heidi looked over at Bruno with complete shock and awe on her face. She had just recovered from his horrific remarks about their wedding night, only to have a bombshell dropped right on top of her. He actually managed to pull it off? Why the hell didn't he tell her last night when they were in bed together? This miserable bastard revealing something so monumental casually over breakfast conversation while stuffing his face with eggs and bacon. Did the war scramble his brains or something? The way Heidi was staring at Bruno was so obvious to everyone around the two of them that nobody said anything and instead ate their food silently and awkwardly. Meanwhile, Bruno behaved as if he were completely oblivious to his wife's fury, nonchalantly eating his breakfast as if he had not just leaked history's greatest secret casually over breakfast with his family. Elsa, of course, was too stunned to say anything, trying her best to comprehend what her father had said. And just when she was about to say something, the man just happened to shut her up in his own perfect way. You know, breakfast is cooked perfectly today. The bacon is so crispy it practically melts in your mouth, just the way I like it. You did a wonderful job cooking as per usual, honey. The words were naturally directed to Heidi and instantly quelled all of her fury and rage as she received the slightest compliment from her husband, turning her from a lioness who was about to tear into a scandalous jackal to a domesticated kitten in the span of seconds. Erwin stared at his parents' interaction with a sudden and newfound understanding of a relationship dynamic he had been observing his entire life, something nobody else in the room seemed to quite understand. He could only mutter beneath his breath the epiphany he had received, provoking a silent wink from his father as he did so, the only man who appeared to have properly heard the boy despite being most distant from him. The man is a genius. Even Alia, who was right next to Erwin clutching his hand, did not accurately hear what he had whispered, raising her brow as she questioned him over it. Did you say something, dear? Erwin simply shook his head and refused to acknowledge he had said anything, as it appeared that only the two men in the room realized the exchange of glances at one another. It had suddenly dawned on Erwin that his father had become a master of defusing his mother's sudden fits of rage over his increasingly clownish behavior, a trait that he only now realized would become a lifesaver later on in his own marriage if he too managed to learn how to properly gain such an understanding. The rest of the time spent at breakfast was done, so discussing Elsa's engagement to the future Tsar of Russia and why Bruno believed this was a good fit for the family and for the girl, who herself seemed quite open to the idea. As though she had limited contact with the boy over the years, she appeared to possess a favorable impression. As for Erwin, he was subtly watching the way that his father interacted with his family, gaining as if it were some kind of secret revelation, the entirety of his understanding of his family's dynamic, and his father's ability to carelessly yet masterfully take care of everyone's emotional needs and mental development was something he had never noticed until this very morning. It was almost as if infinite wisdom had been bestowed upon the boy, as his memory flashed back to the foundation of discipline and respect his father had built for him, while treating his sisters entirely different, only to slowly over the years incorporate more freedom and mentorship into his own life, while becoming more authoritarian to Eva and Elsa as they got older. His entire history with his family swirled in Erwin's head, forcing him to realize that his father had been far better at raising him and his sisters than he had ever thought before. And in the end, he smiled and shook his head, taking a sip from his coffee, before voicing his truest and deepest thoughts aloud. I'm such an idiot. Chapter 388, The Devil's Absence. Erwin's wedding was the dawn of a new era for Europe and the world. Just as in Bruno's past life, so too in this one did the end of the Great War bring massive consequences, both for the vanquished and, in ways unforeseen, for some of the victors. With the war won and demobilization underway, soldiers of the Central Powers began their long journey home. Many returned to their old towns and villages, seeking any semblance of stability after years spent in the hellfire of war. Yet, no matter how much they tried to reintegrate into civilian life, they could not outrun the ghosts of the trenches, the battles won, the brothers lost, the horrors endured. The scars of war were not merely etched into their flesh, but branded into their minds. And for many, there was no true homecoming. Bruno had foreseen this grim reality long before the first shot of the war was fired. He had known that not all wounds bleed openly, and that the memories of war would be a torment for those who lived through it. But one wound, in particular, threatened to devour entire generations: addiction. To fuel the war effort, pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine had been distributed among frontline soldiers of the Central Powers. It was an effective stimulant, sharpening reflexes, numbing exhaustion, and instilling an artificial courage in those sent to the slaughter. Yet, like all miracles of war, it came with a terrible price: addiction. Men who had once charged into enemy fire without hesitation now found themselves helpless against a new enemy: chemical dependency. Alcoholism, narcotic abuse, and the unending ache of trauma were bound to follow. That is if not for one man's foresight. Bruno had ensured, from the very beginning, that methamphetamine usage in the German army was tightly controlled. Dosages were monitored. Distribution was restricted to the front line only, and any soldier showing signs of dependency was immediately rotated out and sent to one of the treatment centers established before the war even began. Alongside this, massive investments had been made in medical research, particularly in the fields of addiction treatment, neurological trauma, and psychiatric disorders linked to battlefield experiences. The effects of Pervitin, cocaine, and other highly addictive substances were studied with scientific rigor, and preventative measures were woven into the very framework of the Reich's veteran reintegration programs. Bruno's wife, Heidi, through her vast charitable foundations, had played a critical role in softening the hardships faced by returning soldiers. It was her influence, not Bruno's, that led to comprehensive pension systems, stable housing initiatives, and specialized employment programs for war veterans. Where the state failed to cover expenses, her network of noble families stepped in, further cementing the expectation that those of great wealth and power must serve the people. Through their combined efforts, Germany had preempted a crisis before it could ever take root. But while Bruno's soldiers returned to a nation that had prepared for them, the same could not be said for Austria-Hungary. Unlike the Reich, the Habsburg Empire had issued Pervitin, heroin, and cocaine to its soldiers with little thought toward its consequences. No controls, no treatment centers, just high doses and empty reassurances that the war would be over soon. It hadn't helped that, in the final years of the war, the empire had absorbed Serbia, a decision that had only exacerbated ethnic violence within the Balkans. The annexation, rather than bringing unity, had turned into a smoldering ember, one that, combined with mass addiction, rampant corruption, and an expanding black market, was poised to engulf the entire empire in flames. If Germany was to annex Austria and its key territories without breaking ties to the Habsburgs, then the inevitable collapse of the empire had to be managed carefully. That meant one thing: Bruno needed a leader for his mercenary force. The force had already been trained, armed, and financed, a black operations unit, untethered to any official institution, created for the quiet work that could never be acknowledged by the Reich. But it had no commander. Bruno had delayed and delayed, refusing to choose a successor for one simple reason: no one was good enough. No one was as ruthless as Erich. No one was as unflinchingly loyal. No one was as unburdened by morality. The man he needed would have to be the Reich's warhound, capable of waging proxy wars, suppressing uprisings, and executing the quiet culling that kept empires strong. This was not a role for just any soldier. Bruno had pored over file after file, name after name, yet none could match Erich's sheer brutality, the monster Bruno had been forced to put down. He had thought no one could ever be worthy. And then, one night, as he sat alone in his study, a bottle of vodka in hand, his eyes fell upon a name that had once echoed across history. A name that should not have existed in this timeline. A man who had, in another life, crushed Marxist revolutionaries during the chaos that followed the Great War. A man who had once been instrumental in the rise of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. A man who had led the Storm Battalion and reshaped the political paramilitary landscape. He was not supposed to be here. Yet there he was, staring back at Bruno from the worn piece of paper in his trembling hands. Ernst Röhm. Now that is a name I have not heard in a very long time. Bruno continued to sip from his bottle of distilled spirits for some time, looking at the label deeply with a glazed expression in his eyes. For many moments, he would silently stare between the bottle itself and the application in front of him. In the end, he sighed heavily, placing the bottle down on the table before closing its lid and sealing the half-drank liquor inside once and for all. Having done this, he swiftly stood up and brought the container with him towards the lone door, which acted as both entry and exit to the office. After flicking off the light and opening his escape route, Bruno sighed heavily and shook his head before dropping the bottle into the waste bin that lied near the door. His voice carried both throughout the darkness of his office and the dimly illuminated hallway beyond, but the words spoken were to nobody in particular. What the hell? It couldn't hurt to just talk to the man. Chapter 389, The Devil You Know. It did not take Bruno long to reach out to the legendary and infamous figure from his past life, whose name was connected to one of the most militant and brutal regimes in history. One whose infamous banners would never rise in this new timeline as a result of Bruno's own actions. Frankly speaking, Bruno had little choice in the matter. Time was running out, and with Eric dead, he needed someone to command the mercenary force which would be critical to establishing Germany's hegemony over the world in the decades to come. Bruno had to make a move, and it needed to be now. No more hesitation, no more debate. Because of this, he damn near immediately summoned Ernst Röhm to his personal estate, the morning after he had come to the decision. A time and date was set, and the man appeared in his home, dressed in the uniform of the German army and with several accolades pinned to his chest. Since this was unofficial business, Bruno himself was dressed in civilian formal attire, not sporting the decorations he had earned through distinction in combat and military leadership, rather having them displayed appropriately on his uniform, which was currently equipped to a mannequin standing proudly within his office. Ernst appeared a little anxious, more than Bruno thought he would, and acted far too formal, immediately saluting him as the man jumped to attention the moment he entered the room. His voice was sharp, disciplined, but carrying an edge of restrained excitement, the kind of anxious energy that comes from meeting a living legend. General Feldmarschall, I have arrived as summoned. Bruno, sensing this unusual display of formality from the man, was quick to respond in a way that cut the tension in the air. At ease, soldier. This is an informal meeting between two men that has nothing to do with army regulations. Do you understand what I am saying? Now take a seat, I have something I wish to discuss with you. The veteran soldier was quick to do as he was told, not saying another word as Bruno pulled out a bottle of distilled spirits and offered the man a drink. I would pour you a beer, but I have yet to have a keg established in my office. Truthfully speaking, I had quite drinking excessively a while back, preventing me from having a need for it. As you can see, by now I'm down to the dregs. As a soldier first, and one who valued the fraternity and brotherhood that came with such a status, Ernst was the type of man who would have vastly preferred a liter of beer over a glass of some sophisticated and expensive 25-year-old scotch. This was a more noble drink for a more aristocratic class, one that Ernst Röhm neither fit in with nor cared to pretend like he did. The fact that Bruno had referred to it as the dregs and insisted he would have preferred a toast of beers only helped further enhance the already pristine image that Ernst had in his mind of the man. Nevertheless, since Bruno had already poured it, the man was quick to accept the toast, as Bruno said the words that were commonly spoken upon their unique heritage. To strength and brotherhood. Ernst immediately responded to in a way that Bruno was expecting, as they were both members of the secret fraternity that long since transcended the barrier of generations. To blood and iron. It was a toast spoken by the members of the Iron Division during their time in Russia before their disbanding. Words carried into the units those veterans eventually became the leader of when they returned to active service within the German army. Bruno had read all over Ernst's service record within his application. He was a junior officer in the Bavarian army during the final year of the Russian Civil War and had used his position to secure a spot in the Iron Division's final wave of volunteers. He was in the trenches outside Tsaritsyn and had served beneath Bruno as a junior officer during the Volga campaign. Bruno did not recognize the man at the time, nor did he still recall if they had any personal encounters, but nevertheless, he was quick to make his proposal, as well as the pre-qualification. I have long since been planning for the establishment of an elite force, a brotherhood like the one that marched into Russia to combat the Red Menace all those years ago. An organization that has no official ties to the German army, but still received funding, training, and equipment in secret. Initially, There was another man better suited than yourself to command this unit. But he is dead now. Due to certain circumstances, I was forced to end him by my own hand. It would appear that his loss has become your gain. But I need to know, if push comes to shove, will I have to put a bullet in your brain as well? And should that day come, will you resist your end? Or will you allow me to be your executioner, as Eric had done before you? Ernst's expression was solemn. He did not say a word at first, almost as if he was reflecting on what Bruno had said. Frankly speaking, Eric's brutal end had been in all the papers, and having taken the blame, he was officially, for the time being, branded as a traitor, a mass murderer, and a psychopath. But there were those among the ranks of the German army, especially those who had seen the terror of Belgorod, at work, who knew this to be a false narrative. They did not know why such lies were being spun about their brother, but they understood on a deeply personal and intrinsic level that Eric was not the kind of man to do such a thing, let alone betray Bruno, who he had allegedly shot in his final struggle. Bruno's words had been a silent admission that Eric was acting under his order and had been killed as a scapegoat, voluntarily at that. It was also a warning that Bruno expected only the utmost loyalty from his servants. Should he ask for Ernst's life, he would require it given willingly. And after processing all of this information, the man responded to the inquiry in a way that dumbfounded Bruno and went above and beyond his pre-established expectations. My life is already yours to use as you see fit. You may not remember this, but in Tsaritsyn, when those red bastards used the fog to conceal their charge and rushed into our trenches, I was pinned against a wall by one of those pricks. He was about to take my life with his bayonet. And there you were, the specter of death, emerging from the mists, reaping the souls of all those who dared to stand in your path. By my memory, you killed 100 men that day, as if it wasn't the slightest inconvenience. No, you weren't a reaper. You were a god of war incarnate, an avatar of blood and battle made to resemble the flesh of a man. Since I was destined to die that day, and you saved me, my life has belonged to you since. You want to know if I would willingly give you my life if you asked for it. That is your answer. Ernst, my friend, I think you and I will accomplish great things together. After saying this, a pact was made, not one of pen and paper, but of blood and brotherhood. Though he was no Eric, Ernst Rome was a man more than capable of filling the shoes left behind by his forbearer. And at the end of the day, it was better to make a pact with the devil you knew than one you didn't understand at all. Chapter 390, The Werewolf Brigade. Ernst Rome demonstrated his full potential almost immediately after Bruno appointed him commander of the shadowy mercenary force tasked with conducting black operations on behalf of the German Reich beyond its borders. This unit would handle the security operations Germany would normally finance across its soon-to-be former colonial empire, while also serving as an unseen blade, delivering decisive blows against enemies without direct ties to the Reich. A seasoned expert in counterinsurgency and irregular warfare, Rome had led stormtroopers through the trenches of the Great War and was bound by the Brotherhood of 1906, the foundation of the newly reconstituted Iron Division, whose name had yet to be decided. Over the next few months, Bruno brought him up to speed on combined arms warfare and unit cohesion. This mercenary force would serve as the ideal testing ground for new weapons that Bruno's engineers had efficiently adapted from the previous E-10 pattern weapon systems. The arsenal included E-10-style wheeled armored personnel carriers, each equipped with a 2 cm autocannon housed in a rotating VK 16.02 Leopard turret, and tracked E-25-style infantry fighting vehicles armed with 3.7 cm autocannons in a similar turret design. These prototype armored troop carriers would become the backbone of Germany's restructured military, with this mercenary force serving as the proving ground for their effectiveness. Additionally, new tanks were developed on the E-25 chassis, featuring the formidable 88mm KWK/PAC 43L71 mounted on a rounded turret inspired by the prototype Leopard 1 from Bruno's previous life. Once perfected, this formidable machine would be introduced as the Panzer II, serving as the primary tank of the German armed forces during the interwar period, while the existing Panzer I would be repurposed as an armored scout. Perhaps, in time, these scouts could be upgraded with more powerful weaponry and slat armor to counter emerging threats, but for now, they were more than sufficient. Further additions to the arsenal included self-propelled artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, anti-aircraft guns, armored recovery vehicles, ambulances, and command vehicles, all based on the E-10 and E-25 platforms. Only a limited number of these vehicles had been produced over the past year, enough to equip a single combined arms brigade. Fortunately, the initial wave of recruits for this mercenary force numbered just 3,200 men, making the scale ideal for current needs. As Rome and his troops familiarized themselves with their advanced equipment, Bruno observed with approval. Their uniforms had been modified to distinguish them from standard German infantry, featuring a 1916 pattern uniform in the infamous plain tree camouflage from Bruno's past life. This ensured operational effectiveness in both summer and autumn environments. Load-bearing gear was dyed feldgrau, and arid camouflage patterns blending plain tree with modern troppentarn colors were already in development. This marked the creation of the first fully camouflaged military force in history. After witnessing the unit in action, Bruno knew the name befitting them. In his past life, a term had existed for guerrilla fighters who were meant to continue the struggle against Germany's enemies in the aftermath of a lost Second World War. That insurgency never materialized, largely due to the Allies' establishment of massive death camps under the guise of holding disarmed combatants. But the name endured: the Werewolf Brigade. These were wolves disguised as men, an elite force capable of striking with precision when plausible deniability was required. Should they expand, they would evolve into the Werewolf Group, but for now, the name suited them perfectly. With his mind set, Bruno swiftly approved the necessary funding for the unit's continued operations and summoned its leader to his home to deliver the first mission. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Bruno laid out a series of photographs detailing the unfolding crisis just south of Bavaria. Austria was on the brink of total collapse. The images depicted the rise of brigands, gangs, and armed revolutionaries. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had long been a powder keg of nationalism, and the annexation of Serbia had only exacerbated its volatility. When millions of soldiers returned home from war, addicted to alcohol, methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin, the ensuing chaos nearly obliterated the remnants of the empire. However, Bruno maintained deep ties with an Austro-Hungarian military intelligence cultivated during his campaigns in the Balkans. Those officers and agents who had avoided succumbing to addiction recognized the dire situation at hand. Aristocratic generals aligned with Bruno's ambitions and provided him with all the evidence needed to convince both the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns of a decisive course of action. After meticulously reviewing the intelligence before him, Rome met Bruno's gaze, awaiting orders. Bruno wasted no time. Starting tomorrow, you and your men will move your equipment south to the Austrian border and east to Bohemia. Your objective is to secure key strategic locations and conduct feldgendarmerie operations on my command. I must first meet with the Habsburgs to secure their cooperation, but once I do, the German Reich will begin its occupation of Austria and its crown lands. This humanitarian mission will restore stability, order, and peace. Bruno's tone hardened. You will serve as the vanguard, eliminating those who must disappear without a trace. Do you have any questions? Rome snapped a crisp salute, his response unwavering. Not at all, sir. Your will is my command. Bruno nodded, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Dismissing Rome, he sent him on his way with final instructions. From this point forward, there will be no direct contact between us. You will relay my orders as if they are your own. When the time is right, you will receive my command to act. Until then, proceed exactly as instructed. You are dismissed, Colonel. With one last salute exchanged, Rome departed, leaving no trace of their conversation. As for Bruno, he had his own preparations to make. At dawn, he would depart for Vienna to negotiate with the Habsburgs, setting in motion the first step of a grand design, one that would see Austria finally embrace its rightful place within the German Reich. Chapter 391, Aggressive Negotiations Part 1. The train from Berlin to Vienna was not as arduous a journey as Bruno had anticipated. However, the moment he crossed the border, it felt as though he had stepped into an entirely different world. Once fertile and productive, the land now lay barren, not by design, but as a symptom of societal collapse. Farmers, too addicted to substances, neglected their fields, lost in stupors of intoxication. The young men returning from war, having seen too much violence and indulged in too many government-issued narcotics, were in no state to rebuild their lives, let alone their homeland. Of all the crises plaguing the Austro-Hungarian Empire, long-standing issues left to fester for decades, addiction had been the least expected, yet the most insidious. What should have taken years to unravel had instead spiraled into full-scale disintegration within a single year. By the end of August, violence, hyperinflation, corruption, and unrest had reached such extremes that the once mighty Habsburg realm was teetering on the edge of oblivion. Bruno struggled to comprehend how swiftly this pestilence had consumed the land. The once beautiful countryside had become a wasteland, its aura akin to a post-apocalyptic landscape ravaged by war. Vienna, once a beacon of art and culture, now resembled a vast homeless encampment. In just 6 months, the city had devolved into desperation, with people resorting to whatever means necessary to survive. Theft, racketeering, drug smuggling, counterfeiting, and every imaginable vice flourished. Transactions made in silver and gold bullion rather than the virtually worthless Austro-Hungarian banknotes. Bruno was repulsed by the Weimar-esque degeneration that had overtaken what had once been a thriving metropolis. Shielded by his bodyguards, he surveyed the streets with disdain, voicing his grim assessment aloud. Crime, despair, hedonism. This is not how man was meant to live. I almost wonder if it would be better to burn this city to the ground and start anew rather than try to reverse the tide of sin that has consumed it. His men remained silent, offering no response to his impassioned words. Instead, they reminded him of his impending appointment. "Sir, the Emperor is awaiting your arrival at the Hofburg. If we delay any further, we risk arriving late." Bruno was well aware of the time. He fastened his outer coat over his dress shirt and vest, ensuring his appearance remained regal, yet formally civilian. His only adornments were the grand sash of the Royal Order of St. Stephen of Hungary, its star pinned to his chest, and its chain draped around his neck. The striking ensemble left no doubt. This man was of noble birth. Though displaying such wealth in these desperate times carried certain risks, Bruno strode toward the imperial palace with unshaken confidence, undeterred by the potential dangers. At the palace entrance, the Austrian emperor himself greeted him, his gratitude evident. "General Feldmarschall, you look quite distinguished, almost like a native Austrian. It is a pity your visit is marred by the state of this city. Shameful, truly shameful. What has become of this country? Lawlessness, corruption. Something must be done." Bruno accepted the compliment with a respectful bow before being ushered inside. The stench of decay lingered even here, a repugnant reminder of the city's suffering. "Your Majesty, I am unworthy of such praise, but I must agree with your assessment. The state of Vienna is far worse than I had imagined. However, for you, your family, and your people, I may have a solution. Let us discuss this matter further in a more secure setting." His words carried an unspoken warning. Vienna was no longer safe. The Austrian Leibgarde patrolled the palace grounds in force, their ceremonial uniforms replaced by combat gear. Elements of the army stood guard, reinforcing security measures. This was not merely for Bruno's visit. Loyalists to the crown had taken up permanent residence within the Archduke's home, a stark reflection of the unrest outside its gates. Violence had already erupted. Rioters had been shot while attempting to set fire to the emperor's residence, enraged that the monarchy still lived in opulence while they struggled to survive. Yet the Habsburgs were not to blame. Their wealth had been secured centuries ago, ensuring their continued prosperity even in dire times. If the people had any sense, they would direct their fury at the corrupt politicians and bureaucrats who had sold out their futures, indulging in debauchery while their citizens suffered. Unfortunately, the head of state often bore responsibility for the actions committed under his rule, even when beyond his control. Constitutionalism had stripped many sovereigns of their power, leaving them unable to purge the parasites within their own governments. Acknowledging the pressing dangers, Franz Joseph hastened Bruno inside. Once within the sanctuary of his private office, the emperor expressed his personal gratitude before addressing the crisis at hand. "I owe you my life. If not for you, I would not have lived to see spring, let alone this dreadful autumn. The medicine your company produces cured my pneumonia. My doctor said that at my age, my survival chances were next to none. And yet, I wonder, would it have been better if I had perished in November? To witness the death of my empire in my final days, it is a fate I would have preferred to avoid. The last sight I shall behold before death takes me is the undoing of my life's work. Bruno sighed, accepting the drink the emperor offered. He took a measured sip before responding with diplomacy, tact, and sincerity. That is precisely why I am here, Your Majesty. I cannot stand idly by while Austria burns, not when Germany is on the cusp of a new era of prosperity. Our peoples belong together, culturally, ethnically, historically. The only thing that has kept us apart is the bad blood between your house and my Kaisers. But that is not why I have come. I am here to ensure your people no longer endure this suffering. Say the word, and my wife's charities will flood your lands with food, water, medicine, and the resources we have already employed in Germany to combat the addiction crisis. If necessary, I can deploy paramilitary forces to stabilize your territories. We may not be able to save the lands of St. Stephen, but together, we can preserve Austria in all its glory. Let us not descend into madness and despair when salvation is still within our grasp. A long silence followed. Franz Joseph weighed the gravity of Bruno's offer. To accept meant abandoning Transleithania to its fate while securing the majority of what was Cisleithania from the flames of war. Law and order would be restored. Corrupt politicians, bureaucrats, and criminals who preyed upon the innocent could be dealt with swiftly, justice delivered with a bullet to the back of the head. But the ultimate price was clear, his sovereignty. Even so, if the empire was doomed to fall, he had a duty to save what he could. Thus, the negotiations began. A formal agreement would be forged, and history would be reshaped once more. Chapter 392, Aggressive Negotiations Part 2. You do understand this is a serious matter of international consequence. I can't just have the German army roll through my borders and occupy my lands. Even as an act of security against the ongoing crisis, to do so would immediately signal that the reign and sovereignty of the Habsburg dynasty has come to an end. By the time your soldiers arrive in Vienna, my family and I will either already be overrun and killed in the streets by the rioters or forced to flee to Bavaria. Either way, it will immediately spell the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and make your occupation and security operations all the more unbearable. We have millions of young men returning home from the war, plagued by shell shock and addicted to a litany of narcotics. Many prowl the countryside as lawless brigands, while others engage in criminal operations to secure the substances they need to maintain some semblance of sanity. You would instantly be facing such a crisis if you brought the German army into Austria. Even with my permission, it would spark unrest and violence almost immediately. So unless you have another plan, I fear sending troops to help stabilize the region is impossible. Bruno did not seem defeated by this news, much to the bewilderment of the Austrian emperor. No, in fact, he was quite confident. The glint in his eyes suggested he had already anticipated this and prepared long in advance for such a gruesome reality. His words and the tone in his voice cemented this fact in Franz Joseph's mind when he heard them spoken. You're quite right. What your people need now is food, water, medicine, and help overcoming their vices. But these brigands and outlaws must still be dealt with. You simply do not have the force of numbers left untainted by the poison flooding your country's noble veins to do it on your own. Luckily for you, I have a rather unique solution. After the war ended, some old acquaintances of mine, who had retired from the army and military life altogether, formed their own paramilitary force. They are currently seeking fortune in exchange for providing their expertise to foreign nations and have no official ties to the German Reich. For the right price, they could be persuaded to fight for you and your dynasty against whatever enemy you point them at. Franz Joseph scoffed at Bruno's remarks, his tone laced with disbelief at such an antiquated idea. He expressed his skepticism openly, well aware of Europe's bloody and turbulent history. Mercenaries? Seriously? That is a bit of an archaic concept, don't you think? Bruno, however, did not immediately respond to the Austrian emperor's dismissal. Instead, a conceited smirk appeared on his face as he forcefully grabbed the bottle in front of him and poured more of its contents into his glass without first seeking express permission. An outrageous action that caused the Austrian emperor to frown but did not outright provoke him. It was only after Bruno sniffed the fine whiskey imported from Scotland and took a sip that he finally spoke. And his words were far more enlightening than Franz Joseph had expected. It is a brave new world, my friend. Nations are rising and falling as we speak. The old ways of conscription are going the way of the dodo. The future of warfare will not be waged with large, overwhelming numbers of poorly trained men forced into service, but by smaller, elite, professionally trained soldiers equipped with the best weaponry money can buy. And, of course, soldiers of fortune who allow a host nation to maintain complete and total deniability while raking in a fortune performing security operations and other unspeakable business that would normally not only cost them a pretty penny, but also permanently leave a black mark on their history as a nation. Mercenaries, free companies, these are old and obsolete terms. No, I much prefer the moniker private military corporations. It's a suitable rebranding for a new and prosperous era, don't you think? Private military corporations? The very idea was absurd. The privatization of warfare? What kind of nonsense was this? Franz Joseph, a man of noble and ancient lineage, could not help but scoff and condemn Bruno for what he believed to be a fool's prize. You would seek to profit from warfare? Are you mad? Now it was Bruno's turn to scoff at the Austrian emperor's outdated understanding of warfare. He broke into a brief bout of laughter before narrowing his eyes and lecturing the old man about the new age they were living in. With all due respect, Your Majesty, I don't think you quite understand the world as it exists today. Warfare has long since been a business. In fact, it is the most lucrative business in the world. Why do you think your ministers, parliament, and bureaucrats were so willing to go to war with the world over the death of your son and presumed heir? Do you think it was notions of chivalry and honor that compelled the world to engage in such madness, resulting in the deaths of nearly 10 million people? Possibly more. No, it was profit. The arms corporations of each nation have received an ungodly sum as a result of the blood on their hands. And that money goes straight into the pockets of the politicians who made this war a reality in the first place. At least a significant enough portion of it to justify such chaos and destruction. War is a racket and has been for a very long time. Because at the end of the day, there is nothing more valuable in this world than the monopolization of violence. It is the difference between dynasties that last 1,000 years and those that will be forgotten in the annals of history within a decade. It's the service my friends provide, and I assure you, they are the best at it. See, the beautiful thing about small, elite, highly professional, highly motivated forces is that they can afford the best equipment. If you thought the Eighth Army was a mechanical force of wonder and death, wait until you see the Werewolf Brigade in action. And yes, they come with air support units attached. You may have the nerve to mock the size of their forces, but do not question their might. These 3,200 men will break your enemies, will fight the moment they make contact. If they somehow still manage to find the courage to face death itself in armed struggle, well, then their fate is already sealed, isn't it? I would advise you to think carefully about what I am offering you, Your Majesty. The future of your house and your nation depends on your next words. Franz Joseph could only sit in silence and shock as he cautiously reflected on Bruno's words. Could the use of mercenaries really be the answer to his current woes? If that were the case, then they were indeed worth any price asked of him. Because of this, no words were exchanged for some time as the two men sat there drinking, waiting for the Austrian emperor to reach a conclusion on how to proceed. Chapter 393, Aggressive Negotiations Part 3. Silence persisted between the two men of power longer than anyone could have possibly anticipated. Even Bruno himself was shocked by how long it took the Austro-Hungarian emperor to finally make a sound. For a moment, he even thought the man had strained his mind so much that, in his old age, he had suffered an aneurysm and died on the spot. But in the end, Franz Joseph sighed, completely relenting to Bruno's terms as he did so. All right, fine, consider me convinced. I really hate to say it, but I think I have no other choice. Name your price, and so long as you can fulfill your end of the bargain, I will pay it in full when the job is concluded. Bruno smirked as he stood up, straightening his jacket. There was no reason to settle on a price now. No, As a businessman, he knew that unexpected costs could arise in any process, and with the vast wealth of the Habsburg family, there was no reason not to exploit that reality. As a result, he was quick to extend his hand in friendship while also stating his final terms. When the job is complete, I will send you an itemized bill of all our expenses, which can be paid in full upon fulfillment of our agreement or in payments over an agreed-upon time if it turns out to be more than you originally anticipated. Like I previously said, war isn't cheap, but you can rest assured you will be given the greatest combat force that money can possibly buy. And yes, these professionals are indeed exceptional at their jobs. Whether fighting the organized army of another nation or rooting out guerrillas and irregulars, I assure you, the job will be done to a standard so clean and proficient that you might consider hiring a company of my men full-time as advisors to your lead guard. Now, if my terms are acceptable, you can shake my hand. I will let the men know that they are in business, and they will send over a formal contract within the hour. After that, you can expect them to have already begun operations by the time you wake up in the morning. By the way, you should make it abundantly clear to the forces under your control that you are hiring these men and where they are coming from well in advance of their arrival, because they will be treating anyone who opens fire on them as an enemy combatant and will naturally be ruthless in pursuit of victory under such engagements. Franz Joseph immediately grabbed Bruno's hand, confirming that the terms were agreeable. If it meant saving what he could of his family's empire and securing their future in an increasingly uncertain world, then he would even sell his soul to the devil if such a price was necessary. Though with the kind of men he would be hiring, he might very well have done just that. Only time would tell. Regardless, Bruno left the Hofburg and returned to Berlin, but before he did so, he had conveyed the order to begin the invasion after the paperwork had been settled. By the time the denizens of Cisleithania woke up the next day, they would be shocked to find reports of foreign troops occupying strategic locations and engaging in combat operations against enemy forces. The Balkanization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire would prove to be a violent and bloody affair, one where the new standard of military aviation would be revealed, as new concepts such as paratroopers, airborne logistics, light bombers, and monoplane fighters entered the world stage. But that was a story for another time. For now, Bruno decided to celebrate with his family upon returning home, having secured not only the future of the Habsburg dynasty, but also laying plans in motion that would outright secure the annexation of their lands into the German Reich. By the time Bruno arrived in Berlin, 10 hours had passed. Because of this, the violence within the Austro-Hungarian Empire had already begun. Not that it was much of Bruno's concern. The men he had armed, supplied, and trained were already some of the best the German army had to offer, and with their new equipment, they were even more lethal. No, Bruno quickly entered his family home after getting some rest on the train ride there, quickly greeted by his wife, whom he dragged into his arms and kissed passionately, a little too much so, as he whispered in her ear that he had succeeded in trapping the Austro-Hungarian emperor in a way that guaranteed his dreams would come true. "I've done it, darling. His Majesty, Franz Joseph, has taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. By the time the war in the Balkans comes to an end, Cisleithania will not be able to avoid annexation. Germany will be in a far better position for the future once this has occurred. It is truly the beginning of a new world." Heidi was surprised to hear that Bruno's negotiations had gone so smoothly, but she also had to balance this with the information she had received from the Kaiser personally, who had paid their home a visit while her husband was in Austria. As a result, she took a deep breath before congratulating Bruno, while also making sure to properly convey the news she had been given. "That's wonderful news. But Bruno, you should know the Kaiser was here earlier today, and he wanted to let you know that the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg wants to meet with you. I don't know what it is about, but His Majesty made it seem urgent. As much as I would love to hear all about your most recent trip to Vienna, I'm afraid that duty calls." Bruno could only sigh as he delicately swiped his wife's bangs out of her face. A gentle smile appeared as he kissed her forehead, before assuring her that he would be back shortly. "I understand, but make no mistake. Tonight, you and I will celebrate alone together. It has been a very long time since I have taken you out to Berlin on a proper date, and I will not take no for an answer." Heidi could only laugh and shake her head at her husband's newfound enthusiasm, but she was not going to deny him. especially since he seemed to have found his footing again after all that had occurred within the war. And, of course, the nasty business towards the end with Eric. As a result, she was quick to nod her head and verbally confirm that they would indeed be going on a proper date together later that night. It sounds like a date. I will hold you to it, mister. With this said, the married couple kissed one last time before Bruno was forced to depart. There was truly no rest for the weary in this world, especially for men of power, wealth, and prestige like Bruno. As a result, he was off to another diplomatic negotiation, one that, while he did not realize it at the moment, would also have far-reaching consequences on the future of the German Reich. Chapter 394, Temptations of the Flesh? Be gone. Peace had been restored to Luxembourg after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1916. France's occupation had been brutally dismantled, to the extent that the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg had stipulated that France must not only pay for the damages caused by their two invasions and occupations, but also bear the cost of removing their own dead from the territory. There were simply too many Frenchmen who had perished during the Eighth Army's push through the relatively small sovereign territory. In the years since the war's conclusion, negotiations between the Kaiser and the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg had proceeded smoothly, with Germany playing a leading role in the country's reconstruction. However, the Grand Duchess was deeply shaken, having been forced from her home twice in 2 years. Even her peaceful domain was restless as the agreed-upon time for the withdrawal of German troops approached. Like it or not, a single company of gendarmerie was not enough to protect the Grand Duchy from the chaos engulfing the French countryside. A single company of riflemen couldn't safeguard the people of Luxembourg from the threat of brigands crossing the borders and imposing tyranny. Because of this, Marie Adelaide had requested Bruno's presence, not for any tangible reason, but because he was the one person who made her feel safe. Their personal interactions had been brief, and the last time they had spoken, she had made an inappropriate advance on him. But Bruno carried himself with a paternal-like quality. He was a stoic man of restraint and strength, someone who, even to a young woman in her early 20s like the Grand Duchess, projected an aura of protection. Knowing that the German troops were about to withdraw, she wanted him near to assure her that he would come to her rescue if anything went wrong with the peace process. Bruno, of course, knew none of this. Emotional comfort was not his strength, especially when dealing with distressed individuals. Since he had been personally requested by the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, he expected this to be a diplomatic summons, not a house call. Thus, one could imagine the uncomfortable expression on his face as he sat on a sofa next to the woman who was desperately clinging to him, already flushed from intoxication. He simply raised one hand and pushed her away as if she were a flea-ridden stray. For a sovereign monarch, Marie Adelaide could not help but act extremely childish when rejected so prudishly, while Bruno used his free hand to down the alcohol in his glass as quickly as possible. But she was the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg. She would not be so easily denied. Having already consumed 3 martinis, and without the slightest bit of self-reflection, Marie Adelaide pouted and clung to Bruno's arm, trying to entice him. "My prince, please, I'm terrified. When your brave soldiers leave the borders of my people, we will be wide open to rapacious bandits and scoundrels of the most murderous kind. Who then will protect me? Won't you stay here by my side? My perfect, eternal guardian." Bruno sighed heavily, realizing that the Kaiser had arranged this improper private meeting with a single noblewoman of proper age precisely because the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg was too sweet on him, and that this could be used to coerce her into annexing the region. But knowing the price she was going to ask of him, Bruno would rather die 1,000 deaths than return home to his wife as an adulterer, the type of person he despised above all others. Because of this, he saw this rather temptation of the flesh as a test issued unto him by God himself. He restrained himself in the only way he knew how, forcing himself away from the woman who was trying her hardest to break his honor and integrity as a man, a husband, and a father. Sure, Bruno was a man of great resolve, but he was still a mortal at the end of the day. He was neither saintly nor angelic in nature. And because he was not some divine entity, his morals, virtues, and nobility could easily be led astray by earthly desires if such poisonous thoughts were entertained. As much as Bruno loved and adored his wife, when a beautiful young noblewoman like Marie was quite literally throwing herself at him, professing her love and adoration as she did so. It was something that would most certainly chip away at his resolve the longer it continued. With this in mind, Bruno stood up and began to walk away. Just as the Grand Duchess was about to break into tears after being rejected a second time by the only man she truly fancied, Bruno turned around and stopped in his tracks, sighing heavily as he made her a solemn vow that only the two of them would ever know about. "What you want from me, I can never provide. My heart, my body, my love belong to another, and you know this well enough already. Yet, let no man ever declare I was not bound by chivalry. Should a damsel like you ever find yourself in distress, surrounded by enemies on all sides, my armies will march to the gates of your palace to rescue you as swiftly as the wind blows. You should get some proper rest. Your Majesty, your current state is unbefitting of a woman whom I know is truly virtuous at heart, at least when in a proper state of mind. And a fair warning, not everyone you interact with is a friend who has your best interests in mind, no matter what praise they may speak to your face." Bruno then finished the alcohol in his glass, placing it down on the nearby bar counter as he left the room entirely. With the door shut behind him, he stood still for longer than he should have, gazing out the window, his mind filled with fury. "Wilhelm, you fucking knave. Do you think I'm some harlot which you can hawk to noblewomen as you see fit? Your foolish gesture has not aided in the annexation of Luxembourg, but only complicated matters. I swear to Christ in heaven, the next time I see you, the Lord, my heavenly Father, had better bestow upon me the patience of a saint. For if not, I will commit the gravest of sins," slapping a monarch as if he were some common wench. After saying this, Bruno looked at his watch, realizing he had just enough time to return home and fulfill his promise to his wife. All the while, he remained unaware that his vow to the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg had only deepened her already complicated feelings for him. Chapter 395, Inner Demons? Be gone. It felt as if Bruno had not had a proper rest in over 24 hours by the time he returned to Berlin for the second time in a single day. And he might very well have been right in that regard. Nevertheless, as tired as he was, Bruno intended to fulfill his promise to Heidi. He arrived home, swearing he would keep his vow even if it was the last thing he did in this life. However, he also professed the need to bathe and change his attire. As a result, it was some time before both Bruno and Heidi were ready for their night out in the city. Of course, Heidi took even longer to prepare, and when she finally emerged, she looked like the living embodiment of a heavenly angel. Her usually elegantly tied silky blonde hair was long and flowing, cascading down her left side like a river of molten gold. Its sheen and luster were caught in the light, as her sky-blue eyes flickered beneath the brilliance of the chandelier. The finely crafted sequin dress, which matched the pristine, gemstone-like irises in color, twinkled as if each sequin contained its own spiral galaxy of stars. Long, flowing hair was an unusual choice for the time, but Heidi was well aware that her husband was not originally of this era. She had styled her hair based on a few words Bruno had once said about the fashion trends of his past life, something she had inquired about the night he revealed his secrets to her. The look was visually stunning, especially when considering that despite being in her mid-30s and having over half a dozen children, Heidi still maintained the youthful appearance of a woman a decade younger. It required all of Bruno's strength of mind not to drop his jaw at such a perfect fusion of past and present, a flawless mixture of beauty and elegance. He reached forward, gently grasping her delicate hand, which looked as if it had been sculpted from ivory. He kissed the top of it before pulling the love of his life close against his chest, whispering in her ear the sweet poison that would consume her mind and soul before continuing his assault on her lips. "Are you sure you're not an angel sent from our Heavenly Father to guide me to salvation?" Such an absurd and blasphemous compliment, followed by the almost voracious romantic display, caused Heidi to scoff. She subtly pushed her overeager husband away, reminding him that they were still in the middle of their grand estate's foyer, where the staff could clearly see their inappropriate yet loving display. "Bruno, please. If you keep this up, I might quite literally die of embarrassment. And then what would you do?" Ever the shameless fool, Bruno immediately chuckled at Heidi's words, putting his foot in his mouth as he preyed upon her one vulnerability, her overwhelming jealousy and possessiveness. Oh, if such a tragedy were to befall me, then I suppose I would just marry the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg. You should have seen the way she was trying to throw herself at me today. Bruno then performed his best falsetto, raising his voice to an unnaturally high pitch that mimicked a woman's voice a bit too well. Oh, my prince, won't you stay here by my side? My perfect, eternal guardian. Heidi's previous embarrassment immediately vanished, replaced with pure condemnation and unbridled rage as she ground her teeth ever so slightly. She did not seriously say that to you, did she? Despite her attempts to distance herself from her husband, visibly upset by his playful taunts, Bruno did himself no favors. He tightened his grip on her shoulders and leaned in, whispering like a demon in her ear. Oh, she most certainly did. Having had enough, Heidi wrenched herself away from Bruno, stomping just far enough out of his reach so he could no longer control her. When she turned back to him, the wrath on her face was so openly displayed that a lesser man might have been fearful. Her jaw twitched, and her brows furrowed heavily as she demanded a straight answer from her husband about what he had been up to while alone with another woman. And, what did you say? Bruno chuckled lightly, his tone almost provocative, as he began his answer with words that made Heidi's gorgeous onyx-like pupils shrink to the size of a pin. Well, isn't it obvious? What does a man do when alone with an intoxicated and beautiful young woman who desperately wants to give him her chastity? Heidi's face turned the color of hellfire as she was just about to scream at Bruno, but before she could, he raised a finger to her delicate, rose-colored lips, wearing the most devilishly charming smile he could muster, as if he were the embodiment of Lucifer himself. He spoke the words that completely deflated the fury brewing in his beloved wife's heart and mind. I told her to be gone, that my heart belongs to another, and that if Satan himself came calling for my soul, he would have to get in line, because my beloved, beautiful, graceful, and understanding wife is the sole owner of its possession. Heidi was stunned by Bruno's words like never before. A roller coaster of emotions had completely overwhelmed her. In an instant, all the anger, hatred, wrath, and fury that might have driven her to madness vanished. All that remained was love, adoration, guilt, and sorrow as she broke into tears, clinging to her husband's chest, sobbing as she confessed how much she despised him. You bastard. I hate you so much. You are the only one who knows how to drive me crazy like this. Why must you play with my heart so ruthlessly? Bruno held his wife tightly, calming her with his soothing voice, assuring her that no temptation, no matter how great, could ever lead him astray. He was hers and hers alone. There, my little flower, I'm sorry. I played with your heart a bit too roughly today. Won't you forgive me, dear? But my teasing shouldn't make you so angry. You know I only have thoughts of you, my love. Nothing in this world, no matter how seductive, could ever compel me to sully your honor. I love you, Heidi. With that said, the two of them most certainly did not make it out the door. Captivated by Bruno's mind games, Heidi led them in the opposite direction, straight back to their bedroom, where they spent the rest of the night together. Chapter 396, Full Moon. The full moon hung above the city of Berlin at just the right angle, and pitch that Bruno could gaze upon it while standing on his balcony. The only thing concealing his naked form from the world beyond his estate's gates was a bathrobe. Tonight did not go entirely as he had anticipated it to. What was supposed to be only the slightest of playful teasing towards his wife's more jealous tendencies resulted in a roller coaster emotions that affected them both so great that they spent the entire night in their bedroom rather than on the streets of Berlin like they had planned. Heidi had already fallen asleep, but Bruno was as alert as ever. It was a habit of his long and sleepless night, was actually a norm when critical events around the world were happening. The perpetual itch in the back of his mind, the nagging that there might be a telegram or a phone call that he needed to answer with haste, lest all will come crumbling down around him. Paranoia? Maybe, or perhaps it was the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life forged and tempered in the flames of war. Either way, Bruno stood beneath the light of the blue moon, gazing upon its beauty and grace in the background, as if it were some benevolent spirit radiating an aura of healing upon him. One that did not affect the wounds of the flesh, but rather the spirit and the mind, which were the hardest afflictions to get rid of that a man must bear in this life. In the end, His silent admiration of the world's beauty was interrupted by the sound of his wife's bare feet bouncing off the cold stone tile. She had tried to be stealthy, perhaps as a romantic gesture, but was a woman of noble birth really going to catch a soldier who had spent years in the trenches off guard? I think not. No. Bruno immediately spoke his thoughts aloud with an almost embarrassed scoff as Heidi reached her graceful, yet dainty hands upwards in a poor attempt to reach his back. You know, it is incredibly unwise to sneak up behind a veteran and try to touch him. Men have been struck by much less egregious offenses. Heidi's hand froze midair as she clutched the fine white silk bedsheets that were the only thing concealing her immaculate and divine figure from being fully revealed to the world. She pouted at first, in silence, an act that which Bruno did not turn around to personally witness, could still see nonetheless, perhaps with his mind's eye as he simply smiled and shook his head. In the end, his wife revealed her true thoughts, as she immediately recognized the direction her husband was staring at, lost in thought for so long, that even he himself didn't realize how long he had been standing at the edge of the balcony, gazing off into the darkness of the German heartland. You know this isn't your war, right? I just got you back. 2 years, Bruno. 2 years you were gone. Yes, you came home from time to time, but you and I both know your brief visits only served to further intensify the pain in my heart, the sharpness of my breath, the agony I felt every time I dared to think about what you were up to over there. I know you don't want to hear this, but you have already done everything you can. So please, come back to me. Please come home already. A long silence persisted between the couple, and the more it went on, the more Heidi's delicate shoulders that appeared to have been sculpted from a pristine block of jade by Michelangelo himself began to sink in depression. In the end, Bruno shocked the woman, turning around with a smile on his face, not one of charm, but pure bliss, as he grabbed hold of her dainty cheek and looked her straight in the eyes. Her eyes, which were more beautiful and pristine than even the blue moon above. His words were laced not with the venom of despair that had overcome him for so long, and that he had fought so hard to endure and move beyond, but with the optimism of a man who could see his entire future ahead of him. You're absolutely right. This isn't my war to fight. Not in the slightest. Whatever happens, it is now a matter for history to decide. So come, my darling, let us get some proper rest. Bruno did not wait for Heidi to respond. Rather, he lifted her up effortlessly, a perfect display of the vast disparity of their height, weight, and strength as he carried the woman like a princess, no, a goddess bathed in the ethereal light of the moon into their bed, before hugging her tightly and brushing her silky golden hair. The warmth of his wife's body, and her flowery scent, no doubt from the bath she had taken prior to their initial attempt at proper slumber, combined into an intoxicating effect, lulled Bruno into the first truly deep sleep that he had experienced since he was an innocent child, free from the turmoil and strife that came with the burden of being a hero. Hero? Of what novel? No, that was not Bruno. Rather, he was just a soldier who had spent far too much time away from home. And now finally he was exactly where he was always meant to be. Bruno's fears that he had finally let go of were truly manifested in the city of Vienna. It had only been a year since the war had begun, but Austro-Hungary had been consumed by every vice, sin, and destructive behavior imaginable. In the Balkans, nationalistic and religious paramilitary organizations, forged from the bonds of soldiers that had once waved the banners of the dual monarchy into battle, now waged war against each other. The violence, bloodshed, and destruction only further fueled the despair of those caught within its boundaries, increasing the demand for black-market illicit substances which now flooded the country. We're not talking about pure pharmaceutical-grade methamphetamine, cocaine, or heroin. No, street-grade alternatives flooded the country, sinking their claws into everyone who was desperate or foolish enough to dare their temptation. Mothers and fathers sold their own bodies and that of their children for another hit, while the cartels which fostered such disgraceful behavior fought against one another, and the paramilitary organizations that threatened to cut into their profits, only fanning the flames that continued to burn everything in their path. But there was truly one savior that the lands of the Austrian crown could be thankful for. Or they would be if this heroic army didn't come in the form of ravenous wolves who only disguised themselves as men. The Werewolf Brigade had two objectives in this war of theirs. The first was their official reason for fighting, establishing security and stability in the face of an ever-increasing total collapse of law and order. However, as noble as this first goal was, it was completely muted by the fact that their second hidden goal was far more sinister. Bruno's ability to persuade the Austrian emperor to agree to a form of payment that came only after the services had been rendered and the numbers had been properly added up was the perfect excuse for the werewolf brigade to run wild. Every bullet fired, every ounce of medicine used, every gallon fuel consumed, and every soldier slain in pursuit of stabilization was a cost to be added to the final bill of sale. And the demand for revolutionaries, brigands, and thugs far outweighed their actual supply. Because of this, these soldiers began manufacturing enemies of the state, in some grand crusade against the degeneracy that was poisoning the soul of Vienna and by extent all of Austria. Currently, a company of the Werewolf Brigade was shooting out the lock of a cellar, the breacher utilizing the Browning Auto 5 semi-automatic shotgun that, as a result of Bruno's interference in the timeline, had become a standard issue in the German army. After completely obliterating the locks and hinges, the breacher cleared the doorway, allowing the soldiers beneath his command, who by now were experts in urban warfare thanks to the training they went through after the Great War had come to an end, began to clear the basement of a rather wealthy building with their automatic rifles in hand. This cellar had been confirmed as a center of illegal trade, operating as both a brothel and a drug den, and the men soldiers who entered the room were quick to witness just how wicked these people had become. It wasn't just women for sale in this room as they began to panic at the sound of gunshots, screams, and the storming of armed soldiers into the room. No, their daughters were fully on display for a price as well, an act so sickening that the soldiers couldn't help but round up everyone in the room and begin to arrest them all, putting a bullet in the brain of anyone who dared resist, or perhaps gut them with a bayonet to the stomach. Either way, blood had spilled, and shots resounded throughout the street during the process. After a hard-fought struggle, the company of soldiers dragged dozens of criminals out into the streets from multiple cellars operating in a similar way. The commander of the unit was an older soldier. His sleeves not only bore the insignia of the Werewolf Brigade on one side, but the Iron Division on the other. He was smoking a cigarette as he silently tilted his head, causing all but one of the soldiers beneath his command to raise their rifles and ruthlessly gun down the prostitutes, pimps, and drug dealers in the streets. However, one soldier hesitated, looking mortified at the young girl, who was no doubt a victim of her own parents' addiction and wickedness. She was crying, perhaps no older than 15, as she begged for mercy. As if sickened by the hesitation this low grunt was showing in the face of duty, the officer pulled out his sidearm and walked in front of the man, who only realized what was happening before it was too late. The officer pulled the trigger, a resounding crackle of gunfire breaking the sound barrier as the young girl fell to the floor, completely lifeless as her dead eyes stared at the young soldier who had failed to save her in disbelief and despair. The soldier instantly broke out into a fit of fury as he screamed in disbelief at his commander. "Why the hell did you do that?" She was innocent. The commander pointed his sidearm at the rebellious soldier's head, a look of utter calm and callousness in his eyes, as the muzzle of his pistol was still smoking from the execution he had just performed not a minute prior. His words were as cold and sharp as freshly forged steel blade, cutting equally deep into the heart of the soldier beneath his command. "You're not in the business of questioning orders. I give you a command. You obey it without question. This is your one warning. Insubordination will not be tolerated in this outfit. We are here to cleanse this city of its transgressions, and on this night no sinner shall escape our might. You would do well to remember the identity of the man who is signing your paycheck." After saying this, the commander stuffed his sidearm away in his holster and walked away from the hesitant mercenary without saying another word, leaving the man to stare at the wake of the bloodshed they had caused, wondering what the hell he was doing in Austria to begin with. Why was he even here? Chapter 397. The Purge of Vienna begins. The streets of Vienna had become an open wound, festering with blood, smoke, and the unrelenting echoes of gunfire. The Werewolf Brigade's purge had begun in earnest, and though their campaign had already shattered the city's criminal underbelly, the battle was far from over. The resistance was not composed of a singular, organized faction. Instead, it was a chaotic web of brigands, criminal syndicates, and ideological revolutionaries. Ethno-nationalist separatists waged war in the name of their own fractured visions of sovereignty. Religious fanatics saw the collapse of the monarchy as a sign to enact their own holy war, and Marxist revolutionaries, emboldened by the chaos, sought to turn Vienna into the first stronghold of a new socialist order. These groups did not fight for Austria, they fought for themselves. And in doing so, they ensured that the empire's fall would be even bloodier than its slow, inevitable death. A cold drizzle swept through the ruined avenues, turning the cobblestone streets into a mess of mud and blood. The scent of burning flesh lingered in the air, a sickening reminder that the city was being gutted from the inside out. In the depths of an abandoned tenement, now turned into a command post for one of the largest revolutionary cells, Gregor Varga, a former dockworker turned Marxist militia leader, stood over a table covered in stolen weapons and bomb-making materials. The Werewolf Brigade is hitting the brothels and drug dens first. They're dismantling the networks that fund our operations, one of his lieutenants spat. We cannot allow them to keep pushing unchecked. Gregor's jaw tightened. Then we push back. We are not rats to be slaughtered in the street. The monarchy is dead. The revolution has begun. We must strike first and make them bleed. His words were met with nods and murmurs of approval. They had all seen what happened when the Werewolf Brigade came. Entire blocks razed, suspected dissidents lined against walls and shot. Entire families vanished in the night. These mercenaries were not soldiers of Austria. They were executioners, paid in gold and blood. The orders were given, passed through the alleys and ruins like whispers in the wind. Small cells of fighters, some with military experience, others nothing more than desperate men with stolen rifles, began preparing for a counterattack. The first explosion shattered the fragile calm of the night. A horse-drawn carriage loaded with explosives was sent barreling toward a werewolf supply convoy, detonating in a fiery blast that sent shards of burning wood and steel into the unsuspecting mercenaries. Automatic fire erupted from the rooftops, cutting down werewolf foot patrols as they scrambled to react. The revolutionaries had no discipline, no real tactics, but they had desperation, and desperation made men willing to throw their lives away in the name of vengeance. The Werewolf Brigade, however, was not an army of conscripts. They were hardened killers, veterans of the Great War, men who lived for battle, and now without one to call home had resorted to mercenary work. And unlike the revolutionaries, they were true professionals who would use any means necessary to fulfill their contract to the letter, no matter how cruel or immoral. The werewolf troops responded with ruthless precision. Squads formed defensive perimeters, calling in reinforcements from armored half-tracks rolling through the streets like ironclad beasts. The roar of their machine guns drowned out the screams. Flashes of gunfire illuminated the wreckage-strewn streets as Werewolf Brigade riflemen moved house to house, clearing out suspected insurgent hideouts with merciless efficiency. They moved like a pack of predators, well trained and accustomed to urban warfare. Gregor watched from the cover of a ruined warehouse, his pistol steady in his hands. He spotted a werewolf officer barking orders, directing his men to encircle a rebel safehouse. Gregor exhaled, slowed his heartbeat, and squeezed the trigger. The officer's head snapped backward, his body crumpling to the ground. For a moment, the werewolf advance hesitated. Then, just as quickly, it resumed. Gregor's heart pounded as he dove back into cover, chambering another round. The battle was far from over. But for every revolutionary who fell, another would rise to take his place. The Werewolf Brigade may have had superior weapons, superior training, and the unwavering command of a machine without conscience, but the revolutionaries had something else. Nothing left to lose. The battle raged across Vienna, from the narrow alleys of the merchant district to the once pristine boulevards now littered with rubble and corpses. Revolutionaries hijacked trams and used them as makeshift barricades. Drug-fueled street gangs, who had once run the city's vice trade, now fought not out of ideology, but because they had no other choice. The Werewolf Brigade had made it clear there would be no mercy. The fighting intensified as dawn approached. In one district, Werewolf units used flamethrowers to clear out a heavily fortified theater being used as a Marxist command center. Smoke and burning flesh choked the air as the rebels inside screamed and howled in agony. In another, werewolf sharpshooters set up in the spires of cathedrals, picking off insurgents as they ran through the streets, desperate for an escape that did not exist. Gregor's militia had managed to hold their ground through the night, but supplies were running low. Ammunition was scarce, food scarcer. A runner burst into the safe house, panting, his uniform soaked in blood. "The bridge is gone," he gasped. "Werewolf artillery took it out. We're cut off." Gregor ran a hand through his sweat-matted hair. "Then we dig in. We hold out as long as we can." His men did not cheer or rally. They simply nodded, adjusting their rifles, checking their magazines. They all knew what was coming. There was no way out of this city. The Werewolf Brigade would burn Vienna to the ground before allowing it to remain in the hands of rebels. And still they fought. It was near midday when the final push came. The Werewolf Brigade moved in force, tanks rolling down the avenues, their turrets swiveling to rain death upon the insurgents who remained. Gregor's men, entrenched behind overturned trams and broken walls, fired everything they had. But it wasn't enough. Gregor saw his fighters fall one by one. A young man, barely 18, cut down by machine gun fire. A woman, once a teacher, clutching a rifle she barely knew how to use, caught in an explosion that sent her broken body into the rubble. One by one, the revolution was dying. The last thing Gregor saw before darkness took him was the silhouette of a Werewolf Brigade soldier looming over him, rifle raised. There would be no prisoners. The purge would be absolute. Chapter 398. The Purge of Vienna comes to an end. The sun rose over Vienna, but it brought no warmth, no light. Only a blood-red sky obscured by the thick, choking smoke of burning buildings. The battle had raged through the night, and though the streets were lined with corpses, the purge was far from over. The Werewolf Brigade had spent the early hours of the morning consolidating their hold over the city, dividing it into sectors that were systematically cleared one block at a time. The roar of engines filled the air as armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks patrolled the ruins, their mounted guns swiveling in search of any lingering resistance. What little coordination the revolutionaries had was collapsing, their fighters scattered, their lines broken. The purge was entering its final stage. In the gutted remains of a once pristine opera house, Major Gunter Mueller stood over a table strewn with city maps, casualty reports, and ammunition manifests. His uniform, bearing the insignia of the Werewolf Brigade and the Iron Division, was stained with soot and dried blood. He pulled a cigarette from a battered tin case, lighting it with a match struck against the edge of the table. "Sector 5 has been cleared," an officer reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "The stronghold near the Danube was overrun. We captured a few dozen combatants. The rest were shot resisting." Mueller exhaled a plume of smoke while expressing his thoughts in a stoic and emotionless fashion, one that was symbolic of his lack of care or concern for the destruction they had wrought upon Vienna and its people this night. "Good. Any high-value targets?" The voice of the officer was equally as merciless as he expressed without thought, nor hesitation of the wicked deeds they had committed in the name of fortune and honoring a contract with the House of Habsburg. "None that we could identify. The bodies were burned along with the rest of the block." Mueller nodded, grinding the cigarette into an ashtray as he responded to the previous statement with further orders to be relayed across the unit. "Move on to Sector 6. The Marxists still have control of the industrial quarter. I want their last munitions depots destroyed before sundown." The officers saluted and exited, leaving Mueller alone in the dim light of the ruined hall. He leaned against the table, eyes drifting to a shattered chandelier overhead. Just months ago, men and women in their finest evening attire had waltzed beneath its glow, their laughter filling the gilded halls. Now, the only music was the distant crackle of gunfire, the cries of the dying carried on the wind. The purge had to continue. Elsewhere in the city, in what remained of the industrial quarter, the last remnants of organized resistance were making their final stand. The old steel foundries had become fortresses, their towering smokestacks offering snipers a perfect vantage point over the streets below. Trenches had been dug in alleyways, machine gun nests hidden among the rubble. These were the most hardened fighters, men who knew there was no surrender, only death. Gregor Varga, wounded but still alive, crouched behind a makeshift barricade of sandbags and overturned carts. His men were exhausted, their numbers dwindling. They had started as hundreds. Now, less than 50 remained. The wolves are closing in. One of his lieutenants growled in agony as he bandaged his leg, which had been cut severely by glass, barely missing his femoral artery, which would have proven fatal as he grunted in agony and relief at the same time. We should make a break for it. Gregor shook his head as he refused to admit defeat. The idea that they could overthrow the Habsburgs and succeed where the Bolsheviks had failed in Russia a decade prior was too tempting of an ideal to let go, despite defeat being evident to any rational being. No, we hold. As long as we hold, the revolution isn't dead. The words rang hollow even to his own ears. He knew the war had been lost already, but his ideological fanaticism compelled him to continue fighting, even when the result of doing so was clear as day. The attack came without warning. Artillery shells crashed into the foundry, sending shards of molten steel and pulverized brick raining down on the defenders. Flames engulfed the buildings, turning their defensive positions into death traps. The Werewolf Brigade advanced behind the barrage, moving in small, coordinated teams. They fought like specters, swift, efficient, merciless. Gregor fired his pistol, dropping one of the advancing mercenaries. Another took his place within seconds. His men were being picked off one by one. A machine gunner next to him was torn apart by rifle fire, his body slumping over the weapon as it sputtered to a halt. A grenade landed nearby. Gregor barely had time to curse before the explosion sent him crashing into the rubble. As the last bastions of resistance fell, the purge transitioned from battle to execution. Captured revolutionaries were lined up against walls, their hands bound behind their backs. Officers walked the lines, selecting those deemed too valuable to kill immediately. The rest were dispatched with cold efficiency, the streets running slick with blood. Mueller oversaw one such execution. A group of captured revolutionaries, their faces battered and bruised, were forced to their knees in a courtyard. The Werewolf Brigade soldiers stood over them, rifles at the ready. "You are enemies of the state," Falk declared as he convicted each and every one of them to their fate. Whether or not he actually had the authority and jurisdiction to do so was a matter for Parliament and the courts to discuss long after the act had been committed, and he and his men were safely beyond the border in Germany, paid in full for their services to the crown. "Your crimes have been judged, and the sentence is death." The order was given. The gunfire was swift. Vienna had returned to the rightful rule of the Habsburgs. Civilization, as savage as it was, had been restored to a city that in merely the span of the year had resorted to degeneracy, chaos, and the control of local gangs and warlords. Chapter 399, The Next Generation of Infantry Weapons Part 1. Bruno emerged from the bath, a long and hot steam having done wonders not only for his fair and ivory complexion, but also for his mental health. Sometimes, one simply needed to soak away their troubles and put things in perspective. Because of this, the man emerged from his bath and noticed that the way he had washed his hair left it naturally slicked back, its golden sheen highlighted beneath the illumination of the light bulbs. But something was off. His hair had gone too long without a proper cut, several millimeters beyond regulatory length for service within the German army. As a result, he was quick to reach into the nearby drawer and pull out a pair of fine scissors, personally styling his own hair until it was prim and proper. Afterward, he applied a product that allowed it to be styled and set before properly dressing himself. His body was littered with scars of every kind imaginable, on the front at least. Bullets, bayonets, fragmentation. There were even a few jagged and uneven slashes from more makeshift weaponry, like entrenching tools. The scar tissue was perfectly layered within his fine jade complexion, like the watery pattern of carbon within Damascus steel. It enhanced his already rugged and masculine body more than it detracted from it. Nevertheless, he was not some savage who walked the outside world without any shame. No, Bruno was quick to get himself dressed as he emerged from his bathroom and headed towards his personal office, where the papers he had been dabbling with the night before lay atop his desk. The ink had dried throughout the cold and dehumidified night, and yet his work remained painfully unfinished. What was this work, you might ask? The introduction of the Reich's next standard issue rifle. If one had any inclination of basic military weaponry, the design displayed was perfectly obvious to those who gazed upon it. The weapon was a typical assault rifle design, a concept that was still completely alien to the rest of the world. What was an assault rifle? And how did it remain distinctive from other rifles currently in service, like the Select Fire Fedorov Avtomat or the semi-automatic Gur 43? Well, the answer lay in the cartridge with which the weapon was chambered. For example, both the G43 and Avtomat rifles made use of a full-sized rifle cartridge. The advantages, of course, being power and range. The disadvantages were its controllability in automatic fire and, of course, factors like magazine capacity and the weight of the ammunition a soldier needed to carry. The assault rifle, or the Sturmrifle, was a concept created by the Germans during the Second World War of Bruno's past life, first entering service in limited numbers as the MKB-42 in 1942 and later refined into the MP-43 and STG-44 variations. The rifle was distinctive from all others insofar as it made use of an 8x33 Kurs cartridge. What was the 8x33 Kurs? It was a standard 8x57mm Mauser bullet with a cartridge that was more or less cut in half. Why was this so effective? Because it solved the previously discussed problems commonly associated with battle rifles and semi-automatic rifles. A properly manufactured STG-44 was practically recoilless. For those who had the divine grace bestowed upon them necessary to handle one, they described sustained automatic fire as like shooting a hose. With a 30-round standard capacity and almost non-existent recoil, the weapon was far easier to keep on target and was lighter in weight and more compact than other types of combat rifles, making it ideal for modern warfare. So if such a thing existed, why didn't the whole world just adopt it as the standard arm? Well, they eventually did, more or less, with the next generation of small arms, such as the AK series pattern rifles and the Armalite family of rifles, largely superseding any other design during the Cold War era. There were drawbacks, though. Half the powder meant half the power and range, meaning assault rifles, depending on the caliber used, were generally less effective past 300 meters engagement distances. This proved to be a failing point for many units engaging in longer-range mountainous warfare, as was seen in certain parts of Afghanistan during the 21st century. Sure, premium ammunition like 262 Malawian Quachas Mod 1 or M855A1 could stabilize the round at greater distances like 500 m, but beyond that was really pushing the limits of the rifle, and lethality at such extended ranges was far less efficient than at closer distances. Ultimately, in warfare, there was no real one-size-fits-all solution. There would always be some compromise to be made when choosing a standard-issue weapon, which is why armies consisted of multiple types of combatants. The reason Bruno was designing this new Sturmgewehr was simple. The new era of warfare would be fought at much closer engagement distances, and thus, the need for a rifle capable of hitting someone straight through the eyes at 1,000 meters was no longer necessary nor practical. With all of this in mind, Bruno designed a weapon that was both easy to manufacture and required far fewer advanced and rare earth metals than other designs. His Sturmgewehr prototype, which he began drawing as a basic proof of concept, initial blueprints, and a list of requirements, was largely modeled after a blend of the Sturmgewehr 44 and the earlier MKB-42H. Functionally, it was identical to the STG-44, insofar as it made use of a gas-operated long-stroke piston, a closed tilting bolt, and was selective fire. But the primary difference was in the fore-end. Bruno had opted for a combined gas block assembly of the MKB-42H, with an integrated bayonet lug, allowing for the attachment of a K98K-style bayonet to the Type 84 birdcage-style flash hider, which would conceal muzzle flash during combat. In addition to this, Bruno made a requirement for an AKMN-style side mount for the use of mounting optics to the platform, which could be riveted into the left side of the receiver to provide a more stable and rigid mounting platform than the attempts that had been made for the Sturmgewehr during his past life. The ideal combat rifle for the future was a setup like this, making use of a ZF-4 scope with an integrated bullet drop compensating reticle that, while not illuminated, would allow future soldiers to quickly acquire targets at different ranges to improve hit accuracy. This optic setup, like the future Russian PK, a red dot, would be slightly offset to the side, allowing one to make use of the rifle's integrated iron sights during extreme close-quarters scenarios where the fixed 4x magnification was too much zoom. It was the first infantry weapon Bruno intended to introduce as part of a series of modernizations for the upcoming war. And as the stroke of his pen completed the initial draft, Bruno received a phone call from a number he was not anticipating at this time. Upon answering the phone, it became abundantly clear to the man that he was speaking to the leader of the Werewolf Brigade, who gave him a cryptic status update on the war in Austria. Spring seems to have come early for the city of Vienna, while I fear the Balkans will be having one of the harshest winters ever recorded. As for the rest of Cisleithania, it is somewhere in between. Bruno immediately responded in a way that was just as innocuous before hanging up on the man, leaving doubt in the mind of anyone who may have overheard their discussion over whether anything important had actually been said. Understood. While you're in the Alps, make sure to enjoy the slopes. It will soon be the perfect time to get some skiing done. I wish you luck and enjoy your trip, Colonel. I hope to hear from you soon. The words meant nothing to someone snooping where they did not belong, at least, not on the surface. But the intent was clear to those who knew what words to look for in particular, and what they truly meant. Vienna had been secured. The Balkan territories and those of the Hungarian crown were burning in civil war, while the remainder of the Habsburgs' rule over Austria and its lands was in a state of flux. The Werewolf Brigade was on the march to bring the same order and stability they had brought to Vienna to the rest of the Habsburgs' lands, with the same price to be paid for their services, both in gold and blood. But that was not a concern for Bruno. Instead, he got right back to designing his weapons. This was a far more important use of his time rather than worrying about what his pack of warhounds was doing now that he had let them loose in Austria. As for when he was done, he was no longer at war. Sure, he had responsibilities to fulfill at the headquarters of Central High Command. But that was just another office job, free from the perils and worries of the battlefield. He would come home later that night and enjoy the time spent with his family. And that was the greatest comfort of all for a man who had lived through a lifetime of war. Chapter 400, The Cost of Victory. Vienna had become secure and stable. The price was gruesome, more than many were willing to admit. The number of deaths was still being calculated, but the figure was already staggering. Tens of thousands of civilians, criminals, brigands, deserters, and revolutionaries had been claimed in the violence, while a few dozen of the Werewolf Brigade were slain in the process, with 100 or 2 more injured. But they could be replaced, their bodies to be issued crosses, medals of the organization granted to those who had perished with valor. Meanwhile, Franz Joseph could only grieve for his city. The destruction, not just to life but to property, had been so much larger than he had anticipated that he could not help but give Bruno a call. The fury in his voice was clear and precise as he tried to pin the blame for the toll this war had cost him and his people. You said these mercenaries of yours were professionals. What is remotely professional about tens of thousands of innocents lying dead in the streets of Vienna? The number was by no means an exaggeration, but what was perhaps the most shocking was the lack of emotion in Bruno's tone from the other end of the line. There was no lament, no grief, no remorse, no guilt. No, his words were as expressionless as the dead which the Austrian Archduke was trying to pin responsibility onto him. His words, however, pierced sharper than a knife as he stated the true cost of his services in figures so staggering that the aging Emperor Dam near had a heart attack. Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands. Your city was so corrupt, degenerate, and beyond rehabilitation that the men you employed had no option but to wipe them out. These things are contagious to a healthy population, and if left unchecked, your entire country would be damned to hell in the wake of their sins. You owe me in ways you cannot even begin to fathom, my friend, and the war has not yet concluded. You hired the Werewolf Brigade to restore law and order to your lands, and you also authorized them to use any means at their disposal to do so. It would appear you have been away from the battlefield for too long, sitting in your luxury while you and your family were safe and protected, believing that no force on this earth could ever bring your empire to ruin. But you were deceived, blinded by your own hubris, And now the price must be paid to ensure that you and your family continue to rule, and that Austria survives the turbulent era to come. Blood will be spilled, iron will be forged, engines of war will be built on a scale never before witnessed in history. And in the end, you will emerge victorious. And when the werewolf brigade has obliterated the revolutionaries who would see you and your family lined up against a wall, if ever given the chance, the price will be paid in full as you agreed upon in advance. So the next time that the consequences of your naivety prove too great for your feeble old mind to bear responsibility for, do not come seeking me to shift the blame in a poor attempt to assuage your conscience and its need for expiation of guilt. You will hear from me when the time comes to settle your debts. Until then, sit back and reminisce on the days long forgotten, because it is a new era, one in which your chivalrous notions have no place left on the battlefield. I thought the Great War would have taught you that lesson, but I fear you were too stubborn to fully let it take effect. Bruno hung up immediately after saying this, gazing down at the paperwork on his desk, all the while leaving the Austro-Hungarian emperor stupefied at what he had done and whom he had brought into his home, completely unaware of his desires. An army of wolves now marched from Vienna across the Austrian landscape, doing to it as they had done in the capital, and those loyalists to the crown, those men who had come home from the war forever changed by its brutality, but strong enough to resist the temptations of soul-damning vice. They were right by the side of the wolves who led them into battle. It was an unstoppable war machine that sought to burn everything in its path, and Franz Joseph had been the cause of its creation. As for Bruno, he was fulfilling his military obligations at the high command of the German army. He had drafted a proposal designed for the reorganization of the German armed forces. This included the creation of a new branch, turning the Luftstreitkräfte into its own independent organization to complement the Heer and Kaiserliche Marine perfectly. In addition to this, the German naval infantry had expanded into a corps-sized unit within the jurisdiction of the Kaiserliche Marine. In the coming wars, these men would be the bulk of the German armed forces needed for amphibious landings. However, there was another unit that Bruno had helped create from scratch during this new era of peace and prosperity that the German Reich now found itself in. Fallschirmjägers, the German paratroopers. Bruno wanted to begin expanding upon these units, integrating them into the army command structure like paratroopers were in the American armed forces of the 21st century, rather than the Luftwaffe, as they had been in Bruno's past life. But these weren't the airborne infantry of the Second World War in Bruno's past life. Oh no, the Fallschirmjäger Corps Bruno had planned was far more similar to the Russian VDV of the 21st century. Airborne combined arms forces dropped from the air into hostile and austere theaters of combat. Instant relief for those ground forces that were besieged by a greater number of combatants than they could reasonably hold out against on their own. There were, of course, problems with this, and it would take a minimum of 2 decades to solve them. But here and now, in 1917, Bruno intended to lay the groundwork for this grand scheme. The intention was that by the year 1939, presuming the timeline proceeded in a way that allowed the Second World War to break out at roughly the same time as the one Bruno had already lived through, Germany would be in a place to deploy forces anywhere across the world, if all things went as planned, that is,